I'll just make a little progress before we get into the interventions. My right honourable friend's amendment, in effect, gives this government an instruction, which it has taken to our European partners. But this Parliament's mandate must now be given the opportunity to achieve its end, and the Prime Minister the chance to do so. So it is clear that the government's priority is to address the indefinite nature of the backstop, which under Article 50 is legally required to be temporary. And I also want to address the issues of a certain of my right honourable friends who are concerned as to whether this motion gives credence to the government taking no deal off the table. I'll happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
Given this debate, indeed dispute, about the meaning of the government's motion today, can he be clear with the House? In the event the European Union does not agree to a deal which is acceptable to this House and government, we still will be leaving on the 29th of March.
Well, I'm very happy to give my right honourable friend and predecessor in this role that assurance. The position of the Cabinet has been agreed in terms of no deal. It was agreed in response to the Cabinet paper I presented on the 18th of December, and my right honourable friend, and I'll come on to this, has repeated on numerous occasions, including again in a statement this week, in terms of her commitment to the timescale. I'll happily give way.
He's set out why he is observing what the House said in terms of alternative arrangements. Why isn't he also observing and acting on what the House has said in terms of the government ruling out no deal?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is actually the House has said two different things. It's passed legislation. It's passed legislation that has said by a big majority on Article 50, which many members on both sides of the House voted for. It passed legislation to say that we're leaving on the 29th of March. It put that date on the face of the bill by a large margin. The House voted also to give the people the decision through the referendum by a large margin. And the legislation, frankly, takes precedence over that motion. And that, in essence, was the point of order that was raised. I appreciate he's done it at least as an intervention rather than a point of order, but the same point stands. I'll happily give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. In encouraging the government to keep its nerve during these negotiations, and whilst accepting that the vast majority, I think, in this place would favour a good deal over no deal, can the government just confirm, for absolute clarity, that should we not be able to secure a good deal, probably courtesy of intransigence by the EU, then we will not only be leaving on the 29th of March, but we'll be leaving on no deal stroke WTO terms.
As a former member of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, I know my friend knows all about holding his nerve, and he's correct, which is we do, as a Parliament, need to hold our nerve, and we do need to send a clear signal to those in the European Union with whom we're discussing these issues, who share our desire to have a deal, to deliver on our shared values, to respect the fact that we are trading partners and wish to get on to the future economic partnership and work together. But that is the state of people. I give way once more to him, but before taking some further interventions.
I think we all agree about the importance of keeping our nerve, and actually by keeping no deal on the table, it makes a good deal more likely. But can he answer my specific question, and that is that if we don't achieve a good deal, on the 29th of March, we won't just be leaving the EU, but we will be leaving on no-deal terms.
For the avoidance of doubt, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to confirm that, because that is what the legislation says. The only way to avoid no deal, and this is a point that the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, has repeatedly said, but it is the point that is backed up in legislation. The only way to avoid no deal is either to secure a deal on the terms that the Prime Minister has set out, with the mandate that the House has given her in response to the motion. Otherwise, it is to revoke, because the court case says that the only alternative otherwise would be to revoke. Of course, I give way to the Father of the House in a moment, but the only other option will be to revoke. And if revoking, that requires one to be unconditional and unequivocal Of course I get to it.
Well, right on, friend, was just moving on to an alternative. But he's just given, it seems to me, the most stark expression of policy that I've heard the government give so far on what will happen if present negotiations fail. It has alarming possibilities. I mean, he says we're bound by the legislation when we passed Article 50, which indeed we are, but when the House passed that, it was on the assumption that a negotiated deal was going to be arrived at, and we're going to leave on... Well, of course it was. And indeed, at one point, the Prime Minister was presenting to this House what she said was the ideal deal to go on to the full negotiations towards the declared government aim of a proper, permanent relationship with the EU in due course. The idea that simply because the Prime Minister is probably going to fail to persuade the other member states to put a time limit on a permanent open border in Europe, we go for the catastrophe of no deal on an arbitrary date on the 29th of March is ridiculous. And the government could have a policy of coming back here to defer or revoke Article 50 to put the situation in some order.
Well, firstly, I don't accept, whilst obviously respecting the considerable experience of the Father of the House, but I don't know he's going to fail. Actually, the Prime Minister is working in the national interest, he's seeking to bring our country together, and he's seeking to a deal for our country. A short extension of Article 50 does not take no deal off the table. Well, in America, a short extension of Article 50 does not take no deal off the table. It simply prolongs that uncertainty and leaves in place the risk of no deal in a few months' time. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Which one of us? Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me Secretary of State. Secretary of State, the Prime Minister met us in the Boothroyd room before the first vote where she lost by 230, and she said that at that point, if their deal wasn't accepted, it was either no deal or no Brexit. Now, there could have been an amendment down to revoke Article 50 today, but shouldn't the government be moving to that point? Put it to the House. You either have the Brexit that's going to crash the economy, or we forget this silly game with one letter from the Prime Minister of the European Union and revoke this nonsense. It could be over in an afternoon. Get on with it.
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, given the preponderance of the SNP to have independence referendums and then not respect the result, to have a referendum and not respect the result, the one thing we can always be sure of on with the SNP is it won't be over in an afternoon.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Can I say that I very much want to see a deal done? I think it is in the country's interest and it's definitely in the interest of industry. But it is also with wide history of seeing how the European Union will change its mind and will come through with fresh negotiations, perhaps at the very last minute. Can my right honourable friend tell me how his talks have been going on, and does he get the indication that this is exactly what we should allow the government to do?
Well, as is so often the case, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend reflects a sentiment one hears in the country at large, which is the desire for a deal, and that is, as he says, a desire shared by many of those we have been speaking to in the European Union, because they recognise that no deal is in neither side's interest. They recognise that no deal is disruptive, and indeed I come on in remarks not just to what the German Chancellor Merkel has said herself in terms of seeking a solution constructively, but also the fact, if one looks at the political situation in many of those European countries, the coalition that is in place, again, it is in both sides' interest to go. I give way to the member for Belfast North.
Very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way, and of course we want to get a deal with the European Union, but isn't it the case that if you take no deal off the table, that's the surest way of ensuring the other side dig in on their current position? That's just a fact of life. So those who call for no deal to be taken off the table are actually playing into the hands of the possibility of a no deal. And would he also then update the House on his discussions with Irish counterparts, because they play a crucial role and they can't hide behind Brussels, and likewise Brussels can't hide behind Dublin on these issues?
my honourable friend, the right honourable gentleman, is right on both points. I mean, firstly, it is important that we have that on the table as part of that, and indeed the only way to take it off the table is either to have a deal or to revoke Brexit entirely. And he is going to come on, if I'll make some progress, and come on to those discussions, including the discussion my right honourable friend the Prime Minister had with the Taoiseach last week, and also her visit to Northern Ireland as well, where there is a shared desire, because, as he well knows, and indeed the comments from, I think, the highly respected former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern in the House yesterday in evidence to the right honourable gentleman's select committee, where he talked about the impact of no deal from an Irish perspective and the common desire in order to seek ground. But I'll make some progress, and then happily take some further interventions. But I think it's worth just reminding the House, because a number of the interventions have sought to represent the position of the Prime Minister. It's worth reminding the House of what the Prime Minister herself has said, and it is that the government's position remains the same. The House voted to trigger Article 50. That had a 2-year timeline that ends on the 29th of March. We want to leave with a deal. That is what we are working for. That is the government's position, and that has not changed. I'm just going to make a little progress, and then I'll happily take some further interventions. Mr. Speaker, this is also an important issue in terms of the position of European leaders, which is that if the EU were to make changes to backstop, whether that would enable a deal to pass. That is why it's important a clear message is sent from this House as part of those negotiations. Colleagues should be in no doubt that the EU will be watching our votes tonight carefully for any sign that our resolve is weakening. We should not give them that excuse not to engage. And indeed, in the discussions we have been having with European leaders, there is a recognition, as the member for Belfast North reflected, on the shared desire to secure a deal, because the impact of no deal is asymmetric within the EU 27, which is a part of the discussions member states indeed themselves are having with the Commission. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman and then to the honourable lady.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, but given that the European Union is saying that it will not entertain any legal changes to the withdrawal agreement, I share the Secretary of State's desire to get a deal and have made very clear that if it came to it I would consider supporting the government in a future vote. But what I need to know from the Secretary of State is, what compromise is he going to give to this House that better reflects the will of this House, rather than simply putting a deal back to us which has already been comprehensively rejected?
I mean, if you forgive me, I am actually going to come on to that exact issue there. But he cites at the start of that intervention, in terms of the premise that the European position, as stated, is that there will be no movement. Well, actually, the European Union have also stated that they want to avoid no deal, which is hugely damaging. The European Union have also stated that they want to be clear what the will of this House is and what it is that is required in order to secure a deal. Well, it is self-evident there is a degree of ambiguity between those positions, and indeed I will come on to it. The discussions we have been having with European leaders is absolutely on that issue, and that is why we need some time in terms of the vote this evening to continue with those discussions. I'll of course give way to the honourable lady and then to...
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State because he is being generous with his time. But further to his answer to the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price, is he really saying that if the government has no deal in place by the end of March, if it has run out of time, then it would go ahead with no deal on the 29th of March, even when top police chiefs are saying it will make the country less safe, NHS leaders are saying there will be shortages of medicine? Is he 100% committed to no deal on the 29th of March in those circumstances, or are there any circumstances in which he would extend Article 50?
Well, again, what I set out was we're 100% committed to the position set out and agreed by the Cabinet. That position was agreed on the 18th of December. Now, what I was drawing the House's attention to is the fact that the motion today does not change that position. And that position is that it is our priority to secure a deal. I have stated at the dispatch box previously that the best way to mitigate the risk of no deal is to secure a deal. I'll come on to some of the issues in respect of the consequences of no deal. I've been quite clear with some of my colleagues on my own benches that I do view a no deal as disruptive, much more so than some of my honourable and right honourable friends. But our priority is to secure a deal. But the principal operational focus, if not, the principal operational focus, if not, is to prepare for what is the legal position. I'll give way to my right honourable friend and then I will make some progress.
I'm grateful for him giving way. The reality is that the vote against no deal in this House was more convincingly passed, including with cross-party support, than the vote to have the Prime Minister go back and negotiate on alternative arrangements. The government can't simply just pick and choose which votes it wants to support. That is fundamentally wrong and anti-democratic, and it's a totally wrong way to handle such an important issue for this country as Brexit. Does he not see that? Can he not listen to the representatives of communities around this country who are deeply concerned about a no-deal exit and want this House's will to be respected?
Well, again, I very much respect the position of my right honourable friend, and I suspect on this we will agree to disagree, which is what I have set out is firstly the position as agreed by Cabinet, secondly what is the legislative position, and thirdly what is the interplay in terms of the motion before the House this evening. Now, I absolutely respect the honourable lady in terms of how she cast that vote in that division, but the point is it doesn't change the stated position of the government, and that is what I was setting out.
My right honourable friend, who's taking a lot of interventions, but I'm looking very closely at this motion, and I support the Prime Minister's deal. I want us to get a deal. But the words here say support for the approach to leaving the EU expressed by the House on the 29th of January. Two motions carried that night, both of which I supported. I would like to hear from the right honourable gentleman that he gives equal respect to the opinion expressed by that House, for if he fails to do that, it is contemptuous of this House.
Well, firstly, I absolutely respect votes of this House. Indeed, when we had, for example, the humble motion in terms of the Attorney General's legal advice,
Order. Can I just appeal to the Secretary of State? Secretary of State, in my experience, is a most courteous individual, and I understand the natural temptation to look in the direction of the person questioning him. But the House wants to be hearing what he says. Please face the House. Secretary of State.
I absolutely accept your direction, Mr. Speaker, on that point. What I was seeking to engage with my right honourable friend on the point she's making in terms of respecting the House. Of course we do. That also applied, for example, on votes such as on the Attorney General's legal advice, which was disclosed following a humble address, notwithstanding the precedent that creates for future government. The point I was merely stating, which I thought was a point of fact, is that the legislative position as it currently stands is that as set out following the vote to trigger Article 50. That is the position. Now, as you say, Mr. Speaker, I've taken quite a few interventions. I'll make a bit of progress, not least because I'm conscious many others will wish to speak. Mr. Speaker, one part of the amendment tabled by my honourable friend, the member for Altrincham and Sale West, was to explore whether technology offered a solution to the backstop. And I'm grateful to my honourable and right honourable friends who have engaged with this work. Following the support of the House for the motion, including that approach, the Prime Minister gave a commitment to engage seriously with the ideas put forward. And I have held a series of detailed meetings doing just that. The political declaration makes explicit that both the EU and the UK agree to exploring alternative arrangements, and I am happy to commit to my honourable and right honourable friends that the government will take that forward, including both investing civil service resource in exploring its viability and its acceptability to the community as a whole. The possibility of alternative arrangements as envisaged by my honourable friend for Altrincham and Sale West has been reflected in the wording of the political declaration. The document notes that the UK and the EU envisage making use of all available facilitative arrangements and technologies. And it goes further with the political declaration noting that such technology should be considered in developing any alternative arrangements for ensuring the absence of a hard border on the island of Ireland on a permanent footing. I'll probably go on.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Will he confirm that using existing techniques and technology that's already been used across the border in Northern Ireland, that actually using those for the future arrangements actually gives a good direction, a good foundation on these alternative arrangements?
Well, I mean, I do agree, because that is actually already agreed by the European Union and the United Kingdom in terms of being reflected in the political declaration itself. And it is an issue I've been discussing with honourable friends and right honourable friends in terms of the alternative work arrangements working group. I also, as I committed to members of the House, raised this in my discussions earlier in the week with Monsieur Barnier. But I must be frank also with the House that he was sceptical in terms of the timescales of that, but we are actively discussing with it, and I simply point out that that is already accepted in the political declaration, and we are exploring, following the working group, what can be done in terms of the timescales around that work. I give way to the Honourable
for giving way. In terms of the alternative arrangements working group and the Malthouse compromise that we've all read about, can you tell the House, is that now government policy to take that forward, and will he take a fully worked up proposal to the European Union as part of the negotiations?
I can confirm to my honourable friend is we have taken it forward to the European Union, in that I have raised it with Michel Barnier. I will be discussing it again with him. He has raised some initial concerns, but we are making that case and discussing it with him. But it is already accepted by the European Union in terms of the political declaration and the work stream that will flow from that. Of course, I give way. Of course.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. He's just told the House that he has put proposals in his discussions with Michel Barnier. Can he therefore explain why yesterday Donald Tusk said, and I quote, still waiting for concrete, realistic proposals from London on how to break the Brexit impasse?
Well, one should always be slightly cautious about what is said on Twitter generally, and that applies even to someone as esteemed as President Tusk. I was simply updating the House in terms of the discussions I have had with Michel Barnier, as my opposite number from the EU Commission side, in terms of following up on what this House agreed, which was that we should explore that, and we have engaged seriously with colleagues on it, and we have raised it with the European Commission. Mr. Speaker, let me make some progress.
Simon. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. The task as he set out in terms of the alternatives is large, and the window to deliver it is getting smaller. In the interest of pragmatism, could I just urge my right honourable friend in the front bench? I appreciate we're not going to extend Article 50 for no purpose. But if all it requires is another 3 or 4 weeks' work just to dot the I's and cross the T's, then surely to goodness we are not going to bite off our nose to spite our face.
Hey, I respect the point that my honourable friend raises, but I think what I hear from many, particularly in the business community, is that they don't want more uncertainty. They want to see us move forward. They want to see a deal secured. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in terms of the next steps, will be meeting with President Juncker next week. And today conversations are being held by her with other European leaders. In parallel, my right honourable friend, the Attorney General, is pursuing other avenues for possible legal challenge to the agreement. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has also made the wider government position clear to many in the EU, as I have to the leader of the European People's Party, the European Parliament's Brexit coordinator, and the EU's chief negotiator. In addition, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and myself have met a wide range of key European stakeholders. Whilst the EU's public statements have said there will be no reopening of the withdrawal agreement, they have also said, as I pointed out earlier to the right honourable gentleman, the member for Belfast North, that they want to avoid no deal. They want to reach an agreement. They want an agreement that will be supported by this House. Members will also see the comments from leading European figures, such as the German Chancellor, who spoke of her desire for a constructive solution. And the House needs to give the Prime Minister the time in order to explore that. Of course, give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful indeed to the Brexit Secretary, though he may not be just as grateful to me for taking this intervention. But would the Brexit Secretary confirm that the British Government has absolutely no intention of replacing the backstop, which is absolutely essential for maintaining peace on the island of Ireland, a hard-won peace that we absolutely value in Northern Ireland?
I looked at, with interest also at her exchange on the Brexit Select Committee in referencing the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and in particular the point there around mutual consent and bringing the community with her. And that is a point I think is particularly well made, and it is at the forefront of the discussions the Prime Minister is having with the Taoiseach and with European leaders in the context of the
Most grateful to my right honourable friend. The amendment which the House passed, put on my right honourable friend the member for Autumn West, clearly stated the intention was to replace the backstop with alternative arrangements with the hard border. We've had very, very constructive meetings with the Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker. Could he confirm, therefore, that the Malthouse Compromise is stated government policy and has been put to Monsieur Barnier, and that it now has the full force of the civil service to work it up into legal binding text?
I have already confirmed to the House that this issue has been raised with Michel Barnier. I have also given a commitment that it will be raised again in our next exchange. I have also given a commitment that civil servants are engaging on these issues, but I have also communicated the fact that the initial response from Michel Barnier was to raise concerns as to the extent of concessions that would be required, but that is part of the discussion we're having. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've taken a lot of interventions. I'm conscious that many other members, including my opposite number, will wish to come in, so I will make some progress. It's clear, Mr. Speaker, that a workable compromise with the EU on the backstop can secure a substantial and sustainable majority in this House and give the Prime Minister a clear and irrefutable mandate to get a deal over the line. In supporting the Government's motion today, this House can do exactly that. Getting to a compromise is a challenge, but it is not an unsurmountable one. It requires the EU and the UK to come together and to find a solution. And it calls for both sides of this House to continue to work hard to find and grow the common ground. And I do believe that is in the interests of many watching these proceedings. As we prepare to exit the European Union, this government is focused on its most pressing task, to deliver a legally binding change to the backstop, and we are committed to delivering on that key demand. I'm meeting with the European ambassadors tomorrow to continue making that case. And my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is speaking today with a series of European leaders. We are also engaging widely across this House, be that with the Alternative Arrangements Working Group, yesterday with my shadow opposite number, or the 30th of January meeting between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. So we have a clear outcome, a programme of engagement with European leaders, and engagement across this House. Tonight, members need to give the government time to make good on this work, and as a House, to hold our nerve. To deliver a deal that addresses the twin risks of no deal or no Brexit, and also to respect the biggest vote in our democratic history and deliver what people voted for.
The question is as on the order paper. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move and support Amendment A in my name and the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State ended by saying we've got to hold our nerve. He was all over the place this morning, all over the place on all of the important issues. Mr. Speaker, it's obvious what the Prime Minister is up to. She's pretending to make progress while running down the clock. A non-update every other week to buy another 2 weeks of process, inching ever closer to the 29th of March deadline in 43 days. We should not be fooled. Look at the history in recent months and set it against the exchanges this morning. The Prime Minister pulled the meaningful vote on the 10th of December, promising to seek further reassurances on the backstop. She feared significant defeat, and it was obvious that the backstop was the problem way back then, as it had been through the autumn. That was 66 days ago. It was then 109 days till the 29th of March. And I will in a minute. And she returned with nothing. With nothing. Warm words in the margins of the EU summit in December, and a letter coupled with a statement about Northern Ireland that simply repeated already existing commitments. That's what she came back with. The meaningful vote was then put on the 15th of January and lost heavily. That evening, the Prime Minister stood at that dispatch box and promised to explore ideas with the European Union following cross-party talks on how to proceed. That was 30 days ago. And then 75 days until the 29th of March. I will in just a minute. Then, and 2 weeks after that, on the 29th of March, the Prime Minister voted for the so-called Brady Amendment, calling for, I will give way in just a minute, calling for the backstop to be replaced with alternative arrangements. Extraordinary. A Prime Minister voting to support her own deal only on condition that it's changed. Conditional support for her own deal. Now, nobody prepared the business community for that. Nobody prepared Northern Ireland for that, or EU leaders. And anybody who's spoken to businesses or been to Northern Ireland or spoken to political leaders in the EU in recent days knows that by three-line whipping her own MPs to vote against the deal she negotiated, the Prime Minister has lost a good deal of trust in the process. I will give way.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Can he not understand the nonsense of his own argument, suggesting on the one hand the Prime Minister is trying to run down the clock, and then listing the various occasions where she has attempted to stop the clock, get a deal and exit the European Union?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I think the honourable members missed the point. The Prime Minister has spent weeks. The honourable member wants to answer and wants to interrupt whilst I'm trying to speak. The Prime Minister has spent weeks and weeks and weeks trying to negotiate changes to the backstop. It started way before the vote was pulled on the 10th of December, and it's gone on ever since, and she's got absolutely nowhere. I will give way. I'll just make the next point and then I will give way. The idea that the vote on the 29th of January for the Brady Amendment gave clarity is for the birds. The government united around a proposition that they want an alternative to the backstop. But uniting around an alternative that means different things to different people doesn't get anybody anywhere. And that's the central problem. I will just in 1 minute. Yesterday, after another non-update from the Prime Minister, what she said about the backstop was this. Tuesday, I'm corrected. She said on the backstop she wanted, and she listed three things. One, a time-limited backstop, or an ability unilaterally to end the backstop, or alternative arrangements. That's how she put it. Well, the first two of those have been repeatedly ruled out by the EU for months, and there's no sign of any movement. And the Secretary of State, in his discussions in Brussels in recent days, knows that very, very well. There's no room for move on those two fronts. The third, I will in just a second, the third alternative arrangement remains undefined. When the Prime Minister is pressed, either here or in Brussels, about exactly what she means, she doesn't say. And the Malthouse Compromise and the answer the Secretary of State give the game away. If that was a serious proposition that the government was engaging in, it would adopt it as policy and put resource into it. But it isn't. And what signal does that send to Brussels about what the government really thinks about the Malthouse Compromise? I will give way.
I'm very grateful for the right honourable gentleman giving way, and can I commend him for his courage and bravery in standing up for his own alternative arrangements, which of course include a second referendum. And I just wonder, how is he getting on with that within his own party? But more importantly, does he believe a second referendum would increase or decrease investor and business confidence in the United Kingdom?
Well, I'm happy for the concern. I'm getting on fine. Thanks very much. And I'll tell you the one thing. On business certainty, I'll tell the House this, because I've been talking to hundreds of businesses across the country. Even in the last 10 days, I've been in Belfast, in Cardiff, in Birmingham, and in Dublin talking to businesses. And what they're most concerned about is the uncertainty of the situation that we're in now. And all of them would welcome anything that prevents a no-deal Brexit. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Isn't it the case that all these meetings and activity that he is outlining are not, when it comes down to these alternative arrangements, are really just the repetition of the Brexit unicorns on no hard border that we've heard time and time again, and that the reality is the government's strategy on this is the same as it's always been, which is the desperate hope that Chancellor Merkel will come to the rescue and that the European Union will throw Ireland under the bus.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that intervention and that observation. I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's been talking to businesses as I have, and would he agree with me that the issue of no deal is not simply a matter for March the 28th, it's a matter for now, because exports can take 6 weeks. Companies are making the decisions now as to how they will need to be planning to trade.
Well, I do agree with that, and one of the things that saddens me most in the discussions I've had in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and the Secretary of State and others who've had those discussions know exactly what is being said, it is that decisions are having to be made because of the fear of no deal, that decisions are being triggered, and the chilling bit in the discussions I've had, that some of the steps now are irreversible. And it's the first time we've got to that point. I promised I'd give way.
I'm very grateful, gentlemen, for giving on. Isn't the thing that this House has got to understand that the backstop is there in case the Malthouse Compromise turns into the Malthouse fantasy, if all the technologies are technological fantasies, that Europe cannot give up on the backstop because of all the wishy-washy promises from the UK government. They have to stick with it, and they just don't understand that.
Well, the EU has been very clear about the backstop, and there are honourable members working on the Malthouse Compromise, and that is to be observed. But it is equally to be observed the government has not adopted that as its policy position. And I'll just make a bit of progress just on this point, because so it goes on, and so it will go on. The simple and painful truth is this: if there had been a viable alternative to the backstop, there would never have been a backstop. The negotiating parties, as everybody knows, searched for months for that elusive alternative. If there had been an alternative, this Prime Minister would never have signed up to the backstop, and neither would the EU. They searched, and they did not find it. And everybody who has observed the negotiations knows that. The chances of a breakthrough now in 43 days seem to me to be slim. I will give way.
And I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. He makes a powerful point, as always, about the ineptitude of this government. Now, we know that there's not a whole lot of love, even on St Valentine's Day, for the government's deal. We know that. And we know that we're in danger of crashing off the cliff edge with the damage that will cause, and he's right to highlight that. Will he back our amendment that very simply asks for an extension of no less than 3 months to ensure we can avoid that no-deal Brexit?
Yeah. I'm grateful for that, and I do. I have sympathy with the point that we're going to need an extension of Article 50 sooner or later, and frankly, whether a deal goes through or not. The question is, what's the precise mechanism and binding mechanism for doing that? And we will be supporting the bill that's been proposed by others in due course, and I'll come back to that point. I'll give way there.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. He is being generous. But can I just say, in contrast to what he actually has just claimed now, the Secretary of State has been admirably clear in his point that if, although a good deal is preferable to a no deal, if there is no deal, we will be leaving on the 29th of March on those terms. Can I suggest to my Right Honourable Member that actually the Labour Party has this unfortunate habit of taking everything that the EU says at gospel, and that's clearly not the case, and they ignore the fact that the EU could write the textbook on 11th hour deals. Have some optimism and the ability to achieve that.
As for the Prime Minister taking us out of the EU on the 29th of March this year without a deal, we'll see about that. We'll see about that. I don't think the majority in this House are going to countenance that. I think the majority in this House will do everything they can to prevent that. And I will say this, having worked with the Prime Minister when she was Home Secretary and I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I know she's got a deep sense of duty, and deep down, I do not think that this Prime Minister will take us out without a deal on the 29th of March, and that's the basis on which we should be having this discussion. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Brexit Secretary for giving way, and he's absolutely right about what he says on business and the need for clarity. And it is clear for all to see that this government will need to apply for an extension to avoid no deal, even if it has a deal. But the reason they are not doing so, and that Brexit Secretary is not saying what he should to give certainty to business, is because that party will not face down the party within a party that is the ERG. Face these people down.
Well, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that intervention, and the honourable member puts his finger on it. Mr. Speaker, I am going to make some. I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way on that point. And is he not as astonished as I am that we have a Prime Minister and a government that are willing to play this kind of reckless gamble with the future prosperity of our country just to keep their rotten party together?
Well, it is a gamble. It is a gamble. I'm going to make some progress. I've taken a lot of interventions, and I'll take some more in a minute. I will give way later, yeah. The simple point I was making is this, and I stand by it. Both sides of the negotiation have been searching for this alternative for most of the negotiations, and certainly since the Phase 1 agreement was signed off December a year ago. They've been searching for the alternative, and they haven't found it. If they had, we wouldn't have a backstop. And the likelihood of them finding it in the next few weeks seems very slim to me. And even if they do, the chances then of the deal getting through and everything that has to follow by the 29th of March is even slimmer. There is so much legislation that needs to go through, so many statutory instruments. And that exposes, Mr. Speaker, and this has come out through the comments across the House, that exposes what is really going on. A Prime Minister who is running down the clock, hoping to get to March or even the end of March, and this House should remember the next EU summit is the 21st of March. So if we're getting real changes to the deal, that's where it's likely to be signed off. And then at that late stage, the plan is to put essentially the same deal back to this House as a binary choice, my deal or no deal, perhaps with some additional words which the attorney can say have real significance, but it will be essentially the same deal. That, Mr. Speaker, that is not holding your nerve. That is plain reckless. And we have to say no. I will give way.
I'm most grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman giving way. He is indeed being extraordinarily generous today. No self-respecting businesswoman or businessman would walk into a deal for negotiations and take no deal off the table. What we have here is the United Kingdom negotiating a business deal, the biggest business deal in the history of the United Kingdom. It therefore makes sense that we keep no deal on the table, because we know the history of the EU, that they do make concessions at the last moment. We need to hold our nerve, because if we do, then at the wire we will get a good deal which will be in the interest of both the EU and the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how to let the honourable member down gently, but let me try this. We are so patently unprepared for no deal that it is not credible. It is not credible that we can. Let me just give this example. There are very serious allegations against people in custody under European arrest warrants across the EU, going between our country and the EU 27 and vice versa. If we leave without a deal, we haven't got any arrangements in place to deal with that. The idea that we're going to do it in that way is simply unfounded. And I'll also say this, Mr. Speaker, because I've heard this argument before that if we actually face the truth and say no deal isn't credible, somehow that plays into the EU's hands. We heard this for the last 2 years. When I stood here and said we need a plan, the government would publish a plan. Because remember the days they said they couldn't even publish a plan, their objectives, because it would give the game away. The negotiations would be over. And then they published a plan. Then I stood here and we argued, I argued that we should have the impact assessments. And what was the response? If we have the impact assessments, the show will be over. Nobody in negotiation would do that. And then I stood here and said we need the legal advice, and we got the same argument. Well, if you do that, the show will be over. You'll give everything to the EU. And now the same thing on no deal. It's not credible and it's not going to work. Mr. Speaker, no, I did say I'd give way over there. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Invisibility cloak on. Just over a week ago, there was a petitions debate about extending Article 50. Over 100,000 members of the public sent that in, and I spoke in that debate. It was sparsely attended. But can I say I did not hear from their front bench, the shadow front bench, that it was the policy of them to actually extend Article 50. In fact, it sounded from some of the speakers as if it was actually to have a people's vote. Can you confirm what they are arguing for?
I'm sure the question of policy is important, but I'm just facing the facing the practical reality. We're 43 days away from the 29th of March, and there isn't a credible alternative in sight. Now, either we accept that or we don't. And what's going on is the Prime Minister keeps coming back, giving a non-update. I'm meeting people. She's not saying I've actually agreed anything. Yeah. Can I have another 2 weeks? Yeah. And we've been going on like that for weeks, and it's got to stop. That's why, now I'm going to make some progress. That's why Labour's amendment today is intended to put a hard stop to running down the clock. It says that on the 27th of February, the government must put a deal to the House for its approval or bring an amendable motion so the House can take control of what happens next. And it's essential that we do so. Businesses are saying to us, well, they can't wait any longer. They're putting off investment decisions. They can't tolerate the threat of no deal. They're making contingency plans. We're implementing them, and some of them are irreversible. Yes, I will.
I am very grateful to him for giving way, thank you. He's making a very strong point about the perils of no deal, but would he agree with me that this government's position on no deal is not just criminally reckless, it is plain stupid as well, because the EU knows as well as we know that no deal would hurt us an awful lot more than it would hurt them. So threatening to put a gun to our own heads is not a clever negotiating strategy.
I agree, and I'm grateful, and that's really the point. That if it's not credible that we can leave on the 29th of March without a deal, and it's not, it actually isn't a negotiating stance at all. And it's never been seen in that way, and it doesn't work. And this is just farcical to suggest that we've got to keep up this pretence that we're ready, because then the EU will back down. It is ridiculous. Mr. Speaker, let's just put some detail on this. We've heard the warnings from Airbus and Nissan about future jobs and investment in the UK. And yesterday from Ford, another huge UK employer, who said that no deal, and their words, would be catastrophic for the UK auto industry. And Ford's manufacturing operations in this country. And that the country would, take whatever action is necessary to preserve the competitiveness of our European businesses.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is right to say that business wants certainty, and he's made big play of that. But it was the Confederation of British Industry, it was the FSB, it was GE Aviation in my constituency that said, for goodness sake, back the Prime Minister's deal. And he didn't do it, and he must understand that in failing to do so, he and the Labour Party become complicit in a crash-out.
Well, I'm not going to take that lying down. For this reason, on those benches, did they vote for the deal on the 29th of January? No, hang on, hear me out. The answer to that is no. And then anybody who voted for the Brady Amendment was saying it's conditional on change. So don't lecture anybody else about voting for deal. Even the Prime Minister says, on reflection, I'm not voting for my deal unless there are changes. Well, you really can't throw the challenge across the House that we've got to support the unchanged deal, but the Prime Minister wants it changed. Some on the benches opposite will casually dismiss the threat of job losses as Project Fear. It's not Project Fear, it's Project Reality, and it's the jobs and livelihoods of those that we represent that are on stake. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will give way again. So we need to take whatever steps are necessary to prevent a no-deal exit. 2 weeks ago, this House voted to approve the motion tabled by my right honourable friend from Birmingham, Erdington, and the right honourable member for Meriden. That was hugely welcome, and it is just as binding on the government as what else was passed that evening. And you can't choose one part and not the other. And what it did, it showed what we've always said on this side. There is no majority in this House for a no deal. But make no mistake, I will give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I've listened carefully today, and in defence of the Secretary of State, he's made it quite clear that the government's policy, if it comes to it and the deal doesn't pass on the week beginning the March 25th, the government policy is to leave with no deal.
Yeah.
Is he clear in his mind what his party's position will be in the same circumstance?
I am, and happily we discussed that at our party conference and agreed unanimously, something I don't think that happened at the honourable member's party conference. The honourable member knows very well what it is. It is to vote on the deal. If the deal doesn't go through, to call for a general election. If that doesn't happen, two options: a close economic relationship and a public vote. And that was the position that we took. And we committed, to complete on this, we committed at our party conference to ensure that we take whatever steps are necessary to avoid a no-deal exit. And we will do so. I will give way.
Excuse me, I have a bit of a head cold. It's because of the amount of
white flags being flown. It would give anyone a head cold. But can the Shadow Secretary confirm? Can the Shadow Secretary confirm that the Labour Party's position is that there must be legally binding changes to the withdrawal agreement on the backstop? It's the same position as the members in this bench.
The position of the Labour Party is that we have concerns about the backstop. This is a very serious point, and I intend to answer it. I haven't yet met anybody who doesn't have concerns about the backstop, both here and in Brussels. But we also recognise that at this stage, with the Article 50 window all but closed, we need a backstop. And it is inevitable that we need a backstop, and that is our position. I will give way.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to the Shadow Brexit Secretary for allowing me to intervene on that very, very important point. The Right Honourable Gentleman is very knowledgeable about Northern Ireland and is a great friend to Northern Ireland. He will recognise the importance of the backstop to the people of Northern Ireland and across the United Kingdom indeed. So there seems to be some confusion about what his party leader, the leader of the Labour Party, says about the backstop and what he, as the Shadow Brexit Secretary, says. I think the people of Northern Ireland, indeed this House, are entitled to clarification from the Right Honourable Gentleman about what exactly the position of the Labour Party is on the backstop.
He doesn't like it. I'm grateful for that intervention, and as the honourable member knows, I worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years with the policing board, and know how deeply this is felt in Northern Ireland across all communities. And I was there for 2 days last week, and I made the point there that although we have concerns about the backstop, we do accept there must be a backstop and it is inevitable, and that therefore, notwithstanding those concerns, we support a backstop. And that's very important. Now, I'm going to make some progress. I've been waiting.
Honourable Member for giving way, because I actually find I agree with a great deal of what he's saying. He's saying that leaving with no deal would bring huge consequences for our economy and we shouldn't countenance it. But he's also saying that within the withdrawal agreement he sees the need for a backstop, and I've listened closely to what he said before, that he also agrees on the elements about needing a transition period and needing the certainty on citizens' rights. So given that he now appears to agree with everything that's in the withdrawal agreement, why won't he vote for it, and what more does he need?
I'm not sure the honourable member carefully read the proposition we were voting for in the meaningful vote. It was the withdrawal agreement and a political declaration taken together, and the statute requires them to be taken together, because you can't read the withdrawal agreement without reference to the political declaration, and vice versa. What I've said about the backstop is important, and it's important I say it for the whole of the United Kingdom, but particularly for people in Northern Ireland, and I stand by it. But, Mr. Speaker, no, I will give way.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. Is he able to clarify in plain English at what point the Leader of the Opposition will unequivocally back a people's vote?
The policy we've adopted is clear about what the options are, and what we're trying to do today is to put a hard stop to the running down of the clock. That will enable options to be considered in due course. I hope that will happen, and when they are considered, we will take our position and we'll see where the majority is in the House. Now, I'm going to make some.
Will he give way?
I will give way. Sorry, Chris, I wasn't.
I'm grateful for
Giving way. The backstop is obviously taking up a lot of the discussion here today because it is incredibly important. Can I remind my honourable friend that in the debates leading up to the meaningful vote, concerns about trade were mentioned 3 times more than the backstop? Can I encourage him to move on now from the backstop and talk about all the other problems that people across this House have with this deal?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, because one of the central problems in all of this is that the political declaration is 26 pages long. It is vague in the extreme and simply talks about a spectrum of outcomes. The main theme of the political declaration is this: the extent of any checks at borders will depend on the degree of alignment, therefore there's a spectrum of outcomes. Well, I think we all understood that within hours of the referendum. And the idea that that is the position, and that is why, I will give way in just a second, that is why there's all this pressure on the backstop, because the political declaration is so ill-defined. I will give way.
Following his replies to the honourable members for Bracknell and Totnes, does he agree with me that the government has clearly rejected Labour's offer of a less damaging Brexit, and to wait until the end of March to activate our unanimously agreed conference policy in favour of a public vote would be far, far too late?
Well, I'm grateful for that point. What I will say is this. Just as I'm about to actually give the answers from Senator Britt, what's the answer? Perhaps just listen. The position is this. As the House knows, we set out the position of the Labour Party in a letter to the Prime Minister in clear terms, setting out what a close economic relationship would look like. What was written in that letter has been well received, not only in the United Kingdom, by businesses and by trade unions, but by the EU and EU leaders. It is a credible proposition. We are now. I just want to complete on this because it's an important point. The Prime Minister has replied. The Prime Minister has replied in non-committal terms. You could say, well, that's inevitable, and we are having discussions, as the Secretary of State says. Now, I'm not going to disclose at this stage what those discussions are about, because they are, by their nature, confidential. They are ongoing. And I think the Secretary of State would want them kept confidential. That's the only way in which they can properly be held. And there are plans for further meetings. But to go back to the point that was raised, there must come a point where the options are clarified and reduced and then voted upon. And I agree with that proposition. And it needs to be done before the end of March. I will give it.
I'm very grateful. My honourable friend is making some important and good points about the Prime Minister running down the clock. But on this issue, he took that round of applause, that standing ovation at the Labour Party conference, which would have a people's vote with a Remain option. So I've been waiting very patiently for that section of his remarks, perhaps to disassociate himself with those from the General Secretary of Unite yesterday, who said it wouldn't be in the country's interests to have Remain on a ballot paper in a public vote. Now, we're aware that sections in letters and sections in remarks can sometimes have a habit of being redacted by others, perhaps further up the pay chain. Will he now assure us that within the next available opportunity we will be voting in favour of a people's vote?
I don't think I need to associate or disassociate with anybody on what my views are. I think they're pretty clear, and we will. And as for the timetable, we will. I've set out the order of events, and I'm going to make some progress. I'm going to make some progress, and then I'll take more intervention. I've taken a lot of intervention. I am conscious. A lot of people who want to speak in this. I want to go back to the motion that was passed about no deal. Because that was passed by a majority in this House, and it is just as important, as I've said, as the other amendment that was passed. But make no mistake, on its own, it's not enough. If Parliament wants to prevent no deal, it has to take further action. We cannot be bystanders. We have to act. And the simple truth is this: we can't declare that we're against a no deal outcome, then do nothing. The government is failing to act. So we must act. Hence, the next step is to ensure that there's a hard stop to running down the clock, to ensure, not at the moment, to ensure that on the 27th of February the Prime Minister must either put her deal or allow Parliament to decide what happens next. But let's be clear, other steps, I'm just going to make this point, let's be clear, other steps need to be taken beyond today's amendment. They will include the bill tabled by my right honourable friend for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, which would provide a further safeguard against no deal and allow the House to decide if the government should seek an extension of Article 50 if no deal has been agreed by the 13th of March. I would hope that anyone who genuinely opposes no deal would see that an extension by that date, the 13th of March, is unavoidable. I will give way.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for giving way? I wonder if he could clarify for me then. I am sympathetic and almost supportive of the efforts from my friend from Pontefract and her bill, which I think is done with good sincerity. Could I ask on the front bench of the Labour Party, though, if we were to have an extension that went further than the 3 months, would it be his intention that we would participate in European Union parliamentary elections? Because I think for those going on the knocker this weekend, we ought to know.
As I've said from this dispatch box, so far as the extension is concerned, obviously it depends on the period, and the period that the EU have indicated might be available is a period to the 1st of July, because that avoids involvement in the parliamentary elections. It isn't our policy to participate in the parliamentary elections, and therefore, so far, for obvious reasons, we won't be. This is a really serious point, because there's this casualness about no deal that somehow we can, in a macho way, march off the cliff. It'll all be fine. It'll be so good for the country. The point is this. The point is this: that if by the 13th of March, just over 2 weeks before the potential for no deal, there is no deal, we have to take action if we're serious about avoiding the calamity and catastrophe of no deal. And I don't mind standing up here and saying I will take whatever steps are necessary to avoid no deal, because I will never be persuaded that it's a good negotiating tactic or could possibly be good for our country. The House will then need to debate and vote on credible options to prevent no deal. We've been clear those options are either the close economic relationship that includes a customs union and close alignment with the single market that's set out in the letter to the Prime Minister, or a public vote on a deal or proposition that can command the support of the House. There are no other credible options remaining, and those options are miles away from the approach the government is currently taking. But first we need to stop the government further running down the clock, put in a hard stop, allow this House to take control of the process. That's what today is about, and I urge all members to support our amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, we've moved to yet another of these almost weekly engagements where we're told historic decisions are about to be taken, a meaningful vote is on the verge of emerging, and all is going to be clear. And every time we do that, one immediately encounters an appalling shambles, which I think is the only way one can describe the current position of the government and of this Parliament, and I am sure is the way in which it's seen by an overwhelming majority of the citizens of this country, regardless of what side of the argument they are. And so far, the debate this day is following precisely that pattern. I've not been lucky enough to have the Amendment C selected that was tabled in the name of and at the behest of the Honourable Member for Bishop Auckland. There is an amendment that has been selected addressing the same problem in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, which is, as far as I can see, we haven't yet identified and certainly not demonstrated a clear majority for any particular course in the course of these debates. We're not being given many opportunities to do so, and we keep retreating when we get given them. So we've got to decide how, on a cross-party basis, quite obviously, when you look at the divisions, some majority is going to be established to pass motions which will bind a government under our constitution, in my opinion, to move a policy to something which resolves this satisfactorily. I give way to my right honourable friend.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend, and I agree with everything he said so far. Does he agree with me that a very important discussion which preceded this business, and indeed some of the questions and answers during the Secretary of State's speech, indicate that actually the only way in which what he and I both seek to achieve, namely a consensus across the House, if the Prime Minister's deal does not succeed, is only actually going to be implementable if we legislate for it and thereby legally bind the government, because the government has made perfectly clear, and the Speaker has, I think, ruled in that direction, that actually they will not be bound by anything short of legislation. And that means we have a rather elaborate process ahead of us as we come to a conclusion over the next few months.
I think I agree with that. I mean, before I give an off-the-cuff response to the detailed procedural point you put forward, yes, eventually we're going to have to legislate in order to achieve, firstly, necessary time, and then secondly, the necessary resolution in the long-term interest of this country of these problems.
I'm extremely grateful to my right honourable friend. He's just referred to the question of legislation, and of course he himself voted on the third reading of the Withdrawal Act 2018, which expressly states that the European Communities Act will be repealed on exit day. Isn't that sufficient proof of the need for the kind of legislation he's referred to? We don't need to have all these mysterious differences, because actually the anchor to the referendum is the repeal of that act. Does he not agree? He voted for it.
The government and Parliament at any time can produce legislation to reform previous legislation because the circumstances have changed. The idea being put forward by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, that the government is now bound by what it passed in Article 50 and by the withdrawal bill, and the government can't possibly contemplate amending the withdrawal bill or asking us to vote again on Article 50 is, with great respect to my right honourable friend, one of the most preposterous propositions that I've ever heard anybody put before this House. The government has every possible power in its hand to decide to avoid the calamity of leaving on the 29th of March with no deal whatever, not based on any long-term prospect that is in somehow a pursuit of the national interest, but simply leaving on the 29th of March with no deal because absolutely nobody here is able to agree in sufficient numbers with what on earth they want to do. And all we're doing is vetoing each other's propositions for what gets forward. This all started when the government's policy went completely off the rails, when it got defeated by a record-breaking majority, when it produced the agreement it had taken 2 years negotiating, pursuing what before that was a clear strategy. It is obvious that you do need a preliminary agreement, a withdrawal agreement, on these three issues before you actually politically leave, if you're going to, on the 29th of March, and then you've left, but you're going to spend some years more negotiating the long-term arrangements, not only in trade and investment, but in very many areas of activity, where we've based all our arrangements with the outside world on EU membership for almost half a century, and it's going to take a very long time to sort out sensible arrangements after that. We all know the government's agreement was rejected. I voted for it. I was in favour of the government's withdrawal agreement. There's nobody in this House who would more wish to see us remain in the European Union. That is, I think, in this government's interest, but the majority of leaving in this House is overwhelming. Coming face to face with reality, perfectly harmless, nothing wrong with the withdrawal agreement. It gets us into a transition period and we can negotiate. I won't go on about my views I've given them before. There's nothing wrong with the Irish backstop at all. It's a complete invention to find things wrong with it. That put us in a dilemma. And it got defeated by a variety of people with totally conflicting objectives. The biggest vote against it was the Labour Party, officially, and it is rather puzzling, as interventions earlier showed, to know quite what it was the Labour Party had against the withdrawal agreement. I've just heard the Irish backstop accepted by their front-bench spokesman quite rightly. It is necessary, unfortunately. The money's been settled, nobody's arguing about EU citizens' rights. They voted because they were a divided party, and they decided the only thing they could keep themselves together on was all voting against the government. That was all. Now, actually, there were, as both parties are shattered now, the big parties, there were large rebellions on both sides. The biggest group of people who joined in the defeat were actually ardent Remainers who, unlike me, are firm believers in a people's vote. And they're still facing difficulties. They don't want us to leave on any terms. So they're going to keep... I'll give way to my right honourable friend, my best friend amongst all these arch Remainers who are otherwise my political allies day in, day out in this House. But they all voted against it, and they're still threatening to do so because they don't want to leave, and they think it should be a people's vote. And then there was a faction of people who weren't content just to vote for the political agreement, because it's going to take years to negotiate. It is rather general, and wished to be reassured that actually we could put on the record before we started negotiations that basic and sensible things like staying in a customs union, having some regulatory alignment and so on, were established before we started. Of course, if they were established, then all these arguments about the Irish border go completely out of the window, because you've got an open border in Ireland and you've got an open border in England. Now, I would like to see that. I would vote for that. I have several times. I voted with the official opposition once or twice on a customs union. But it's not actually necessary, because everything is up for grabs after we leave, and there'll be a wide-ranging negotiation, and I think the pressure of business interests, economists, people of common sense on both sides of the Channel will drive us towards something like that in some years. But meanwhile, where we are now, the government has pursued one of the factions on our side of the House. We have a kind of breakaway party within a party, a bit like Momentum, really. Got their leader, got their chief whip, they're ardent right-wingers, and the government has set off in pursuit of these bizarre negotiating tactics, though some of them say, but also some of them seem positively to want to leave with no deal, because any agreement with foreigners from the continent is a threat to our sovereignty. I'm not going to give way anymore, not because I have great respect for my honourable friend, so I hope I'm not going to be too disparaging of his views. He and I fundamentally disagree. But lots of people want to speak, and I can't give way as if I was a front bench spokesman. That's not possible. That is the wrong group to pursue. The Brady Amendment, which I voted against, is meaningless. Rejecting the agreement which the Prime Minister spent 2 years getting and had commended in warm terms to this House, and is pursuing a chimera. And we can see from interventions today that a lot of the people in the European Research Group will reject anything they come back with, because they want, some of them, to leave with no deal. So that's where we start from. And the House must start from here, and we have very little time within which to do so. We must get through these procedural obstacles, which the government keeps raising about what we can do and what we can't do, and get some binding policy that the government has got to follow. And some of the people, some of us, even Remainers divided over referendums, have in the end got to back down once a majority is established, and compromise on that sensible majority. That was what the amendment and the Honourable Member for Bishop Walton and I put down. I hope a method that will still be considered a single transferable vote, a ballot, because we will get nowhere until we have some idea of what can command a majority here. I think there is a majority in favour of a customs union. I don't know whether there's a majority in favour of a referendum. There might be. I don't know. I'm certain there is an overwhelming majority flatly against allowing leaving with no deal to take place. My guess is there are 20 or 30 members of this House who actually want to leave with no deal, and they should be rejected. I very much hope that they will be. I do think we will need more time to do it. I'm quite happy to revoke Article 50 and then invoke it if the House wants when we've got some idea of where to go. If we do get through this without a calamity, this immediate crisis, I think any sensible estimate is it will be 4 or 5 years of negotiations for the next stage, starting based on the political declaration of what kind of arrangements we're going to have. We can't let that 5 years go forward in this kind of calamitous debate and constant crisis being allowed to continue throughout. We actually need, before we even start those negotiations, which is why I would revoke or extend Article 50, we need to have a British consensus, a clear parliamentary majority, a path established which the British government can go to Brussels knowing it can command a majority for, and with our partners seeing that we can command a majority for, and we must get through these daft days and eventually, in time, produce a debate which produces a majority for something sensible. At the moment, I think the view in Brussels is they've given up on us. They don't think the British government even agrees with each other on what it is they're trying to pursue. They have no idea what it is the British government's asking now. It requires great faith on their part the British government can get a majority for anything that it's going to produce in the next 2 or 3 weeks if it does get some form of words to amend what we've got. It's time this House found some method, I've advocated some approaches might take, to actually take command of the situation, would actually have the support of the most vast members of the majority of members of the government. It would make the government's position easier, and the vast majority of members, I suspect, on both sides of the House, are looking for such an eventuality to emerge very soon indeed.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move Amendment I in my name, the name of my right honourable friend from Biscay and Lochaber, and honourable and right honourable members, and I'm grateful for the support we've received on the order paper from the Liberal Democrat members here today. This is a much shorter and simpler amendment than the one we tabled 2 weeks ago, because above all else, we need to get the House, and I hope the whole House will agree, to halt, at least temporarily, the headlong rush towards the cliff edge of no deal. And I have to say that I found it extremely alarming seeing the degree of consensus that was developing between the Secretary of State and the No Deal Brigade on his own benches. I hope that is not an indication of where the government's thinking is leading.
They're responsible.
The amendment that was put forward asks for the Prime Minister to seek an extension of at least 3 months. That's important because it takes us past the timing of the European Parliament elections, which otherwise could cause a significant difficulty, certainly for the European Union.
I thank the Representative for giving. Could I ask a similar question to him that I put to my own front bench? Is it the intention of the SNP's amendment today that, if adopted, the United Kingdom would participate in European elections at the end of May?
I think that's an option that has to go, but it's going to be very, very difficult, I would say to the honourable member, because the Europeans have already carved up what was our democratic representation in Europe. I keep an open mind in it. I want us to be continuing to be part of the European Parliament and other European institutions. It looks as if, at least in the short term, Scotland is going to lose that benefit, but I look forward to us getting back in as quickly as possible. The other amendments that have been selected have a lot of merit to them, and I don't think there's anything in them that I would oppose. There isn't anything in them that's incompatible with the amendment we've put forward. But I would ask even the movers of those amendments to look at the text of what we've put forward, because I think that the extension of Article 50 has become
an urgent prerequisite for anything else. We don't have time to spend tabling motions and having debates. We don't have time to spend developing substantial legislation, whether it's substantial legislation about a customs union, about a people's vote, or nothing was happening to prepare us for Brexit. I will give way to the government.
Will he accept that the Speaker, in fact, has ruled that all these motions are advisory, as was the motion that, for no to no deal? But will he accept also that the referendum itself was advisory? And why are we hurtling off the end of the cliff on an advisory referendum when we're not accepting the will of this House that it will be calamitous?
I don't accept the argument that either because it was a close vote or because the legislation didn't say it was binding. I think we have to accept the results of the referendum in each of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. That's why, although I can sympathise with where my honourable friend from the Healing and the Yard is coming from, I would have some difficulty with his amendment, because I don't think we can permanently revoke Article 50 unless we've had a revised decision in another referendum. But when I say we have to respect the result of the referendum, we have to respect the 4 nation results of that referendum. It would be unacceptable, and I think it would be unacceptable for us to permanently revoke Article 50 for England and Wales without asking the people of those nations what they thought. It's equally unacceptable. It's equally unacceptable and equally unconstitutional to ignore the express will of the people of Scotland or indeed the people of Northern Ireland. We have a ridiculous situation for Northern Ireland can't be made to stay in the United Kingdom against the will of its people. It can't be taken out of the United Kingdom without the will of its people, but it can be taken out of the European Union against the will of its people. How does that work? So, Mr. Speaker, I can't see any prospect of the Prime Minister's deal being accepted by Parliament either before or after the 29th of March. I can't see any prospect of the European Union agreeing any significant changes to a deal in the next month that they spent 2 years with the government agreeing to. So we're not going to leave with a deal on the 29th of March. As the Right Honourable Member of the Father House has said, there's barely 20 to 25 people in here who want to countenance leaving with no deal on the 29th of March. So surely the only credible solution, the only tenable solution, the only defensible solution is that we don't leave on the 29th of March. We put back the leaving date until we can sort things out and at least engage in some kind of damage limitation. I couldn't have a speech without giving way to the honourable member from Scotland.
And I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. And he's quite right about the fact that the vast majority of people in this House want there to be a deal that we can leave the European with in an orderly way. But on that basis, given the urgency of the situation, why did the First Minister of Scotland refuse to turn up for a very high-level meeting involving the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Home Secretary, the First Minister of Wales? Why did the First Minister of our country not turn up to that very important meeting to avoid a no-deal Brexit?
It really is a bit cheeky to criticise the First Minister of Scotland for missing one meeting when she's been available to meet every day since the Brexit referendum. And she and other ministers of the devolved nations have attended meeting after meeting after meeting. They've been invited to express their views, and then they've been told their views counted for nothing. Mr. Speaker, any Prime Minister who was putting the best interests of the people before the narrow short-term interests of herself and her own party would have asked for an extension by now. I want Parliament to say, bindingly or non-bindingly, I want Parliament to say to the Prime Minister, ask for an extension. I also want Parliament to be respected when they said, get no deal off the table. Well, I want to make a further point. I don't know if members will recognise the words I'm about to read out. We must reject the ideological templates provided by the socialist left and the libertarian right. Those words, Mr. Speaker, are from the Conservative Party manifesto of 2017. Well, those were the promises in which every single Conservative Member of Parliament here stood and was elected. If no-deal Brexit is not an ideological template provided by the libertarian right, then I don't know what is. So these members have actually been elected on a promise that said we're not going to cope with the disaster of no deal. So I would suggest that if the government are unable to prevent a no deal, then the government has to go, because the government will be in flagrant breach of one of the most fundamental
promises of the manifesto. I think my honourable friend behind me was first.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for giving way and for making a very, very powerful case. Colleagues opposite have made the point about not wanting a no-deal Brexit. Now, regardless of what anybody wants, I'd like to see a people's vote. I'd like to see it remain in the EU. Others are different. All this motion does today is give us that extension that means that we're not rushing this when time is fast running out. And so I look forward to welcoming the member for Stirling through the lobbies with us later on.
Here, here. Mr. Speaker, I never give up on the possibility of anybody in this House or elsewhere finally seeing sense and finally seeing what is best for the people. So I look forward to welcoming the honourable member for Stirling and through the lobbies later on. I think the Father House wanted to intervene. I don't know if he still does.
I was just heard myself being reminded of the party manifesto, which apparently I stood on and which is binding on me at the last election. I've never seen this document. It was produced sometime during the campaign, rather obscurely, and I read about it in the newspapers. No copy was ever sent to me, and I never met a constituent who bothered to get a copy or to read it. It had one rather startling policy in it, which was abandoned within about a day and played no further role. I think another myth is growing, a new constitutional convention, that when you stand for a party and get elected here, you're bound by some rubbishy document that somebody unknown in central office, not the cabinet, has produced, and is meant to bind you for the next parliament.
Rubbishy document. Some rubbishy document. It's certainly an interesting proposal, Mr. Speaker. Can I say that each and every time I stood for election, I have read and often contributed to the manifesto in which I stood on, and I will always endeavour to honour my manifesto commitments to the best of my ability. And I would also expect my party colleagues in the Scottish Government to honour their election manifesto in which they were elected to the Scottish Government as well. Mr. Speaker, the backstop is not the problem for me. In fact, I don't think the backstop is really the problem for anything other than a tiny minority here. The reason that I reject the deal, the reason the SNP and the overwhelming majority of Scotland's parliamentarians, both here and at Holyrood, reject the deal is because it's a rotten deal for Scotland, and changing the backstop ain't going to fix that. It will seriously damage our economy. It will place unsustainable strain on the public services that we hold so dear to our hearts. It will cause wholly unacceptable pain for tens of thousands of citizens who have chosen to give Scotland the benefit of their talents. I want to give just one example of what this means to real people. In November last year, I had the privilege of visiting Glenrothes' twin town Böblingen in southern Germany. The occasion was that town's award of its highest civic order, award to my good friend John Vaughan, a constituent of my honourable friend across the border in North East Fife. It was in recognition of decades of voluntary service that John and his wife Karen have given to the bonds of friendship between our two towns. I later submitted an early day motion to mark John's achievement. I'm grateful to all those who signed it. On Tuesday, my honourable friend told the House that Karen Vaughan has been told that she has to travel to Edinburgh to ask permission to register as a foreigner in her own country. Karen Vaughan has lived in the United Kingdom longer than the vast majority of people I can see in this chamber just now. She's been here for 74 years. Someone whose contribution to these nations can't be measured. Someone who came here as a babe in arms 3/4 of a century ago, after the defeat of Nazism in Europe, is now being told by this Parliament she's got to make a round trip of nearly 100 miles to ask permission to be registered as a foreigner in the only land she ever has known, and probably the only land she ever will know. Mr. Speaker, what have we become? And much more frighteningly, if we have become this before Brexit, where in the name of God are we headed afterwards? If we have a government that sees this as an acceptable way to treat any human being, and of course the government will do as they always do and say that's just an isolated case. Everything about Brexit is isolated cases. Jaguar Land Rover, Nissan, Ford, Airbus, isolated cases. These are not isolated cases. The heavy engineering manufacturing industry is not an isolated industry. Every sector of the economy, every area of our public and civic life has been warning for years that Brexit wouldn't work, and every one of them has been getting ignored for years.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Given his comments on Jaguar Land Rover, will he
join with me in welcoming their decision to add extra investment into the new petrol engine plant in Wolverhampton?
Why not? Well, I welcome any investment at all, but unfortunately there are employees and families of employees in other parts of the Jaguar Land Rover network who do not have so much grounds to celebrate. And I really have to make progress because I know there are other members that want to speak. Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for pointing out from a sedentary position. They've all said to support the Prime Minister's deal. They were all approached by the Prime Minister. They were told by the Prime Minister, it's my deal or no deal. Ask your MPs to support my deal. I was contacted by a number of businesses in my constituency. I also went to see a number of businesses and civic organisations from Northern Ireland that were brought over at the request of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Yes, they all wanted us to avoid no deal, but see, when you asked them what they really wanted, nobody said the Prime Minister's deal is our optimum answer. All of them, with one minor exception, all of them said if they could have what they wanted, we would not be leaving the European Union. If we're listening to the concerns of business, we would not be leaving the EU, and if we have to leave the EU, we would not be leaving the customs union, we would not be leaving the single market. Can I indicate, incidentally, Mr Speaker, that the Secretary of State has explained to me why he has to leave, and accept that, so I don't take any offence at the fact he hasn't been able to stay to the end of my speech. I want to refer briefly to the backstop, but only briefly. The backstop's only there because the government has not yet fulfilled the obligation it willingly signed up to in 2017 to come up with a solution to the border question that honours the Belfast Agreement and yet meets the government's own unilateral red lines. It's no surprise the government haven't come up with that solution yet because the solution doesn't exist. The Minister for State at the Northern Ireland office admitted so at the dispatch box just over 2 weeks ago. So what everyone is calling the backstop would be better described, as it was yesterday by the former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, as a safety net. It's there to make sure that whatever else gets dropped in the chaos of Brexit, the Belfast Agreement will not under any circumstances be allowed to fall and smash on the floor. It's not a backstop, it's a peace process guarantee. That's why it is there. And I defy anyone to say they want the peace process guarantee to be time limited, or to suggest that any party to the peace process would ever want to walk away from it unilaterally. I'll give way.
Since he has cited the Belfast Agreement and he's talking about it falling and smashing on the floor, would he at least take the courtesy of reading the Belfast Agreement? There is no suggestion that in leaving, deal or no deal, that the institutions which are contained in the Belfast Agreement will be broken. There is no suggestion that the ability for Northern Ireland citizens to have Irish citizenship as well will be taken away from them. So at least if he's going to make claims, get them right.
He is getting them right. Well, yes, Mr Speaker, I have read the Belfast Agreement, and if it comes to any arguments about interpretation, with all due respect, I would sooner take the interpretation of the former Taoiseach who helped to write it than of somebody who fought tooth and nail to have it rejected. Mr Speaker, having raised the contribution of Mr Ahern yesterday, I asked a question of Mr Ahern that was designed to show the idiocy of some of the things that have been suggested by the benches opposite as to how Ireland should be responsible for sorting out Britain's mess. And a lot of people in Ireland seem to think it was being serious. I think it's an indication that our friends in Ireland and even people in the United Kingdom are so flummoxed by this shambles, they can't tell the difference between the truth, reality and complete parody. And it's no wonder, because the reality is, we had a Brexit Secretary who didn't know there was lots of votes going in and out of Dover, a Northern Ireland Secretary who didn't know people in Northern Ireland vote on traditional unionist nationalist lines, a Trade Secretary that can't name a single country that's going to give us a better trade deal outside the EU than we've got inside, a Transport Secretary that couldn't organise a traffic jam, and a Prime Minister, well, where do we begin? We could begin with a Prime Minister who ran away from Parliament on the 10th of December and then came back and told us we've got to hold our nerve. Mr Speaker, Scotland is holding its nerve. We're nowhere near ready to leave. I really have to wind up, thank you. We're nowhere near ready to leave on 29th March without a deal. We're nowhere near ready to get a deal before the 29th of March. The deal that's on offer does not give certainty. It gives another 18 months of fudge and uncertainty. And during that time, we need to sort out all the hard bits that we haven't even started to talk about, because yes, the withdrawal agreement was the easy bit. The future relationship is the difficult bit we still have to look forward to. I welcome the fact that 2 years too late, the Prime Minister and her colleagues have started talking to opposition parties, although the Secretary of State still hasn't replied to the request I sent just after he was appointed to meet him in my capacity as the Brexit spokesperson front bench for the third party in this House. He has written to all members of the Select Committee asking to meet us, but he hasn't replied to my specific request. So the Government has started talking to other people, but they have to start listening as well. We need the Government's disruptive and unworkable red lines taken off the table, because it's the red lines that are getting in the way of any kind of workable deal. We need to ask the European Union for more time to let the collective skills and talents of everyone in this Parliament and of everyone in the devolved parliaments and devolved governments to get round the table without preconditions. That means no preconditions to the Prime Minister either. Without preconditions, to work out a solution to get us out of this mess before it's too late. In order to do that, we need to ask the European Union for more time. And on that basis, I move Amendment I.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Dominic Raab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure, as always, to follow the honourable gentleman. I believe the Prime Minister and the Government deserve the time and the space to meet the assurances that they gave this House on the 29th of January, to deliver a legally binding change to the backstop, and to press the Malthouse Compromise as an alternative in Brussels. I want the Prime Minister to be able to deliver Brexit. I want the Government to be able to deliver and make a success of Brexit. And I also want, Mr. Speaker, it to be crystal clear that the only way we will leave on WTO terms is by the choice of the EU through the intransigence of its approach. Now, Mr. Speaker, turning first to the amendments today, it is telling that all of the amendments are process amendments. None stipulate a specific alternative strategic objective of their supporters. So none actually say anything at all about the substance, notwithstanding their criticism of the Government. And as a result, none offer a credible alternative to the path set out by the Prime Minister, which is, of course, written in both to UK law but also reflective of international law under the Lisbon Treaty, namely that we will leave the EU on the 29th of March, either with a deal, as is being negotiated, and which I believe is still possible, or on WTO terms. And I think, Mr. Speaker, we do need to make sure we leave the European Union on the 29th of March. We need it for the certainty and clarity that businesses require. We need it for the finality that the public wants. An end to the tortuous haggle with Brussels, an end to the distraction and the displacement of all the other activity in this place and in the Government at large, which has inevitably followed Brexit. And it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that extending Article 50 cannot make any of the problems or any of the challenges that we've got easier. They can only make them worse. It is also clear, I'll just make a little bit of progress, that the EU will not agree unless there is a clear alternative model on the table which is reasonably deliverable within a finite period of time. Of course, some of the other suggestions that have been made, whether it requires legislation, whether it requires the Norway model or some other whizzy idea that no doubt is being conjured up by thoughtful minds across on the other side of the House and indeed on this, would all require time both to legislate but also to negotiate, and we don't have that time and the EU wouldn't accept it. I give way to the honourable member.
Thank you for giving way. It says it expects a deal can still be negotiated. Now, given one of the reasons for the backstop is the admission that at the moment there is no off-the-shelf technology solution that can provide a working mechanism to have no border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So if there is no off-the-shelf solution just now, how is a solution going to be found in the next 40-odd days that would allow the backstop to be removed? It's impossible, is it not?
Well, no, I think, with respect to the honourable gentleman, he raises a perfectly respectable point. But I think if he listens to what the head of HMRC has said, that we wouldn't need to see any extra infrastructure at the border under any circumstances, and on his point on time, of course, whilst I don't accept the point he made about the absence of technological solutions, we will have the implementation period to work closely with our partners in Dublin and the EU to make sure that can be put in place. Now, Mr. Speaker, of all of the question-begging amendments, the one in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Islington North is the most devoid of credibility for three reasons. On the one hand, the leader of the Labour Party wants to be a member of a customs union, the customs union, but at the same time he boasts of his plans to nationalise half the country, which would immediately and directly conflict with those rules. On the other hand, he personally is widely regarded, although he doesn't say it quite so explicitly, as being a proponent of Brexit. He wants to leave the EU, along with many on his side and on his benches. And of course, it is a requirement of the 2017 Labour Party manifesto. But on the other hand, he's willing to trade free movement to allow open access to our borders in order to get a deal. Again, despite the pledges to exit the single market made in the Labour Party manifesto. And finally, whilst he has pledged in his manifesto to leave the EU and the single market at the 2017 election, he is flirting with a second referendum, and yet without any indication of what the question might be, or indeed which side he would be on. I think that his members in this House, the members and supporters in the various Labour Party associations, and indeed the public at large, are entitled to question and come up to the conclusion that it is nothing but a fraud, a con. It is not a serious position. And I think that is something which was affirmed by the shadow Brexit Secretary, the Honourable Member for Holborn. He talked of the hundreds of businesses he has met who have raised as the #1 issue uncertainty. And I can imagine that, because we've all heard businesses talk about uncertainty, and the public wants some finality too. But if he was genuinely serious, if his party was serious, that is precisely why the Labour Party would rule out extending Article 50, and indeed would rule out holding a second referendum. But the shadow Brexit Secretary did neither. He said he was sympathetic to the extension of Article 50, so he and the Labour Party are fueling precisely the uncertainty that they then criticise. And I'm afraid it's the usual fork-tongue, flip-flopping nonsense from the Labour Party, impossible to square with the clear promises they made in their manifesto. Now, Mr. Speaker, I won't, because I've undertaken to proceed swiftly to the end in order that other members can get in. But I just want to say, in relation to the government motion, I will support the government on all of the amendments this evening, but I have some concerns about the motion, because it adopts as government policy the amendment tabled and passed on the 29th of January by my right honourable friend, the member for West Midlands, which risks implying that we can't leave on WTO terms on the 29th of March. I think that that would be the wrong message as a matter of policy to send to the EU at this crunch moment in the talks, not least given some of the unfortunate remarks reported by ITV from the leader of the civil service delegation in Brussels. I think it also begs the question about how that marries with the position under law in UK legislation, which is our default position, that we would leave on the 29th of March, and which I'd understood was explicitly government policy. And I listened very carefully to the assurances of the Secretary of State, but they then in turn seem to conflict with the motion itself, which is, I'm afraid, the problem that we still need some clarity on. The government motion also makes no mention of the so-called Malthouse Compromise proposal, and indeed we've heard nothing about whether this has been formally tabled with our EU friends and partners. I understand it's been raised and discussed with Michel Barnier, but has a document, has a written version of this actually been shared? We're several weeks on from the 29th of January. This was the basis on which again, the Brady Amendment was adopted, and I think it's a legitimate question to ask. On that basis, I will vote against the amendments, but I am, at the moment at least, struggling with the idea of voting for the principal motion, but I will listen very carefully to the further assurances that ministers will give in winding up, because I would rather be in a position of supporting the government, because I think the government needs the time and the space to go into bat with Brussels to deliver the best deal for this country. We have a reasonable, modest set of demands to get a deal over the line, and we want the government to go in with the strongest hand possible.
Nick Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My fear is that we are just drifting, that we are stuck in limbo on something which is going to have consequences for our country for generations. We know not what the alternative arrangements are going to be. We know not what or when the government is going to bring anything back. And there are only 6 weeks to go. That means businesses have no idea what to do about their April orders, because they don't know what the terms of trade are going to be. It's not just that they don't know whether there's going to be a deal or no deal, they don't even know, if there is no deal, what the basic arrangements are going to be, because the Chambers of Commerce have put questions to the department and still not had any answers about what tariffs would apply and in which circumstances, when rules of origins checks are going to need to be done. The police don't know whether European arrest warrants that they have out at the moment on wanted criminals are going to just be ripped up overnight. The NHS doesn't know what its supplies of medicines are going to be in just 6 weeks' time. And a local business has contacted me, is a manufacturer, contacted me today, manufacturing exports, they export about 80% of their products. And he says that European suppliers are refusing to agree terms for continued supply. They are establishing now alternative suppliers. And that's happening already because there's only just 6 weeks to go. And he says, we are rapidly becoming the laughingstock of the world.
Absolutely.
The Secretary of State, faced with this effective growing chaos, has responded today by hardening his position, I thought, in response to the question from the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden. And I assume that was an arranged response as a result of the threats from the ERG group again today. And the position seems to be that the government is embracing the prospect of no deal if the Prime Minister's deal is not passed. And I've heard people advocate no deal, and heard people in this House advocate no deal, and I would just say those are not the people who are going to be overstretched if the prices of their food go up because of WTO and tariffs and shortages of the border. And they are not going to be the people who will be hit if manufacturing jobs are lost, as so many manufacturers across the country have warned. But all of us will be affected if our border security is undermined because the Border Force just can't do the basic checks of the criminal records of people coming into this country, or to see whether they are wanted criminals because they lose overnight the basic information that they rely on from databases. And I've heard people say too, I will give way to
the Honourable Lady. She may recall that in November the DEFRA Select Committee warned that actually Brexit could cause a huge amount of cheap food imports to flood into the UK. Which particular scare story does she side with? The one that says there'll be cheap food imports, or the one that says that we're going to run out of fruit and veg?
All be true. I think that we should take very seriously the warnings from the preparations that are being done by the Border Force, which talk about potentially up to 80% reduction in the volume of goods passing through the border, and the preparations that they're doing for that, but also the warnings from major supermarkets, from Lidl to Asda to Tesco's, about tariffs on beef, the tariffs on lamb as a result. I will give way, but I'm very conscious of the need to make progress given the number of people who need to.
Did she hear a couple of days ago the food industry say that they could no longer take part in government consultations because they had no less than a third of their staff working on Brexit-related matters?
Well, this, I think, is a really troubling thing that is happening now really right across industry, across every sector. So we heard this week from manufacturers, from the car industry, in fact, who said that they're currently putting tens of millions of pounds into preparations for no deal, and it shows the scale of their concern about no deal, that they are actually hoping that money is going to be wasted. They hope that it will not be needed, but they're having to put that money in the first place. Now, some people said that having no deal on the table is somehow really important as part of a negotiating ploy. Well, this is just nonsense. And the fact that it would hit us more than the 27 of them means this is not like negotiating a business deal, as one honourable member suggested. I'm afraid this is much more like negotiating a divorce, in which you don't just walk out, leave the home, leave all the assets, say goodbye to all of them with no clue where it is you're going to sleep tonight, and have some idea that this is going to persuade your ex to give you half of their pension. It just doesn't work like that. And so the idea that we are taking these risks. Now, I would like to believe the Prime Minister is heading for a workable deal. I would like to believe that she can build consensus, and I have many times called for cross-party consensus and a cross-party commission to oversee negotiations, called many times for a customs union to support Yorkshire manufacturing, for a security backstop, not just a Northern Ireland backstop, and also for some clarity actually about what the future arrangements are, because my biggest concern is that this is a blindfold Brexit that we are facing with no idea what kind of arrangements we face. So I would like to see indicative votes or the kinds of approach that honourable members have suggested. I will give way to my honourable friend.
Oh, thank you. I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I just wanted to see if you agreed, if the honourable member agreed with me, that it is the Prime Minister's red lines on not meeting with our proposal of a customs union which is holding us back and keeping us in this position.
I do agree with my honourable friend that the Prime Minister has to change her red lines, particularly around the customs union and other areas as well, because I think that that is preventing any change, any proper debate about the way forward. And instead what it appears is the Prime Minister is trying to create a sense of crisis in the final 2 weeks, to create a sense of chaos in the final 2 weeks in which the Parliament and the EU and everybody will just be locked in this game of chicken, and in which we're forced to choose between the huge damage of no deal or between a deal that has already been so strongly rejected by this Parliament. And that is just not a responsible way to make decisions. It's not a responsible way for any Parliament to operate, and it is certainly not a responsible way for the government to operate. A government that has a responsibility to keep us safe, to make sure the sick can get their medicines, to make sure the poorest people in the country can afford the price of food. Government that has a responsibility to do things in an effective way and not to create chaos because it cannot get a bad deal through. So, Mr. Speaker, we will put forward a revised bill if we still get to the middle of March and we still have no deal in place. The Prime Minister, under our proposal, would have to choose whether she wants the default to be no deal or the default to be an extension of Article 50 if she doesn't have a deal in place, so she has more time to sort it out. And that would have to be put to Parliament and would give Parliament the opportunity to avert no deal on the 29th of March. A chance to say that the government's approach just is not working and will not have worked if we reach that point. And the problem is, if we don't face up to that, if we don't do something sensible like this, it's like we're just all living in a fantasy world in which we talk about alternative arrangements, we talk about things, we say it's all going to be fine, we say something's going to come along and sort it out, and it just doesn't. I'm going to need to conclude my remarks. It's as if we're all just standing around admiring the finery of the Emperor's new clothes. And actually, the Emperor is running around stark naked, and everyone is laughing at us. Or at least they would be if it wasn't so sad. So I really hope that the government will show some responsibility. I hope they will end up supporting this bill. I hope they will end up supporting this bill. And I hope they will end up, frankly, sorting it out even before we get to that point, before it is too late.
8-minute limit on each backbench speech now applies. Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to support the amendment in my name and the name of many honourable and right honourable colleagues from across this House, indeed all parties, that calls for, in very simple terms, for the publishment of papers that I know have been placed before the Cabinet, that the Cabinet has looked at and debated and discussed, and which in stark terms identify the very real dangers to our economy, to trade and business, of a no-deal Brexit. Now, Mr. Speaker, I had the great honour to serve in Cabinet and to attend Cabinet, and you may call me old-fashioned, but I am of the very firm view that then it must be right that there are times when ministers, when government is given advice by their officials that should remain confidential and that should not be shared beyond the confines of that particular discussion. For very good reason, in my view, and I have, as a minister, made decisions not to share things. I take the very firm view that advice given by way of example, the attorney to government should be subjected to legal privilege. And in those circumstances, as I say, it must be right that civil servants should be able to give advice without any fear that it might be in some way made public, and therefore they in future fear that they can't give that advice robustly and honestly. The difference in this instance is that these papers that the Cabinet debated not only contain important information that I believe certainly my constituents and members of this place should have, but it was the view of a number of members of the Cabinet that those papers should be published. And it is that fact, and Mr. Speaker, I suggest, and nobody has denied to me that that is not a fact, the fact that members of Cabinet take the view that those papers should be made public is the reason why I have put forward this amendment today and seek to persuade honourable and right honourable members to support the amendment. These are not papers in the normal terms. These are papers, I would suggest, of national importance. These papers, I am told, make it very clear what the effects of a no-deal Brexit would be. Indeed, in the words of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, he described a no-deal Brexit as being ruinous. And no doubt he has come to that conclusion, not because he speaks to business, as he undoubtedly does, but he too has had sight of these papers and he has formed that very good opinion, that sound opinion, based on their contents. And I will give way.
The Honourable Lady has been very informative. Would she be prepared to let us know if she's actually seen those papers or who's giving her this information? Because she's talking with great authority that we're supposed to take her word that she's in the know.
Grateful to my honourable friend, and I hope she would take my word. If I say something in this place, it's often not agreed, but whatever one's view is, I don't make things up. And I have asked both the Prime Minister about these papers and the Secretary of State for Business. And on both occasions that I have asked, it has never been denied that they exist. It has never been denied that they have been debated in Cabinet. It has never been denied that there are members of Cabinet who believe they should be published. May I gently suggest to the Honourable Lady they might assist her? I believe she was in a position in this place where she asked a question of a minister about the need for us to get on with Brexit. I don't demur from her point on that. And get on with these trade deals so that businesses in her constituency could get on and trade with all these other countries. Perhaps if she saw these papers, she might know that businesses the length and breadth of our country already trade across the world. You don't need a trade deal to do business and to do trade. What a deal does is enable you to do that business and that trade all the better. So perhaps, Mr. Speaker, really is a very good idea that this place sees these papers so that those honourable members who are actually saying, as a member of the Conservative Party, the party of business, that it would be the right and responsible thing for this country to leave the European Union without a deal, might be better informed as to the consequences. And I'll take one short intervention if the honourable gentleman is
Right honourable friend for giving way. She'd be very generous. I don't agree with her, although I do respect her opinion, but does she accept that she might be asking for another precedent to be set? She sat in Cabinet, she'll know that official, secret, top secret, sensitive documents. Might this not open the Pandora's box for every Cabinet paper marked sensitive to top secret being leaked or let out?
I would not disagree with my honourable friend at all, and I have indeed seen those very same papers myself. Remember, I was a health minister that saw the risk assessment documents that took the very firm view as a health minister that it would not be in the public interest at all for them to be disclosed for the very reasons that I've outlined. But these papers are different because members of the Cabinet, having seen them, have unsuccessfully made the argument in Cabinet that they should be made public. That is the profound distinction in this case. Mr. Speaker, it really would be to the eternal shame of this party if it were to continue to support a no-deal Brexit. I make my views as ever, perhaps sometimes with too much robustness and sometimes with some passion. But I am one of the founding members of the People's Vote. I'm very proud of that. And I do believe that the only way through this impasse this impasse and this mess is for this matter to go back to the country. But I have now taken the view that the bigger national interest, and I say this without any fear from anybody, is that I am no longer prepared not to vote in the interests of my country and my constituents and in accordance with my conscience. But I am now of the view that making sure we do not crash out without a deal is my absolute priority, Mr. Speaker, and that is why I have put this amendment down. And I make that clear to my right honourable and very dear learned friend. We disagree on the people's vote, but on this we are absolutely, probably as ever, we are as one. And it is I won't, and it's not because, it's just that I'm running out of time, and I really want to make a number of very important points. This party is the party of business. This party, the Conservative Party, is the party of competence when it comes to the economy. And history, oh yes, history shows that it is always a Conservative government that leaves office with the economy in better state than when it inherited it, because we always have to clear up the mess that's been made by a Labour Party. That is the simple fact and reality of history. So for this great party to be so reckless and to go against all that we value in our principles by actually suggesting that we should leave without a deal in the face of overwhelming evidence. How many more car manufacturers, Ford, Toyota, Nissan, have to make it clear that if we leave without a deal, it will seriously impact the way that they do business? In the real world, that means our constituents will risk losing their job. Over 800,000 people work in the automotive sector, and that's just the automotive sector. Never mind all the other millions that work in our manufacturing sector. Everybody with a scintilla of knowledge of the real world, of business and trade, knows that the very worst thing that could happen to our country is if we're left without a deal. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the view of the majority of members of this place. And I gently say to the Secretary of State, who is, I believe, a thoroughly good and decent man, Mr. Speaker, his speech chilled me to the bone. He is a Conservative, and yet he stood at that dispatch box ignoring the motion, the amendment that was passed, that was led by my right honourable friend, a former chairman of the Conservative Party, the honourable member, right honourable member for Meridian, supported by Meriden. And I wrote it down as Meriden as well. And the honourable gentleman for Birmingham Erdington, that this place voted for, 318 honourable members supported. The other amendment that was passed by this place, called the Brady Amendment by the right honourable gentleman, my friend, the member for Altrincham East and Sale, was passed by 317. So it is shameful, Mr. Speaker, that when the Secretary of State stands up, he spent almost the entirety of his speech addressing the latter, not the former, even though the former had won cross-party support and the support of more honourable members. But because my party is in hock to the party within the party, which is the ERG, as others have said, funded by the taxpayer and others, with its own leader, with its own whip, he stood and he tossed out red meat to keep them on board, instead of doing what each and every one of us must do, which is to do what is right for our country. And the right thing for our country is to be as one in rejecting no deal and standing by, as this party once did, the people of this country, the jobs, their futures, the prosperity of business and trade.
Hear, hear.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What a mess. What a complete and utter mess our country is in. There are just 43 days to go before we leave the European Union. And as we currently do not have an agreement, we are staring down the barrel of leaving with no agreement at all. And I would just urge the House to lift up its eyes from the order paper, the amendments, the whispered conversations, the scurrying of the whips, the scripted exchanges that we saw earlier, which I have to say at times reminded me of a very badly written play in which some of the actors didn't seem to know their lines, and actually look around us at what we can see. Because we know that companies who export to Europe and companies who provide services to Europe are in a state of despair. Some of them are spending millions and millions of pounds on preparing for the worst, including moving their operations across the Channel. What did we read this week? Official figures from the Dutch Investment Agency showed that 42 companies relocated to the Netherlands last year, citing Brexit as the reason. Other firms have no idea what to prepare for. Last week I was on a train, and the man opposite me leaned over and he said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Of course." He runs a small firm that makes products, and he sends his fitters out across Europe to fit them to their suppliers. And he told me his largest customer had rung him up and said, "Can you promise me that if there is a no-deal Brexit, that you will be able to continue to fulfil my orders?" And he looked at me and he said, "What am I meant to say to him? Because I don't know the answer." And I had to look at him and say, "Well, I don't know the answer either." And I wonder whether, in replying to the debate, the Minister will be able to tell him what the answer is. Because his fear, and we heard it from my right honourable friend, is that their big customers will say, "We're not taking the risk anymore, we're taking our business somewhere else." Look at those who manufacture. In Britain, we've heard about Airbus, about Nissan, about Jaguar Land Rover, and most recently Ford. Look at those who export from Britain. We spent much of this week debating the fact that the trade deals we were promised would be rolled over by now are not all going to be rolled over by now. And the truth is, we are not ready, we are not prepared, and most members of this House know that no deal cannot possibly be allowed to happen, and yet it remains, and we heard it from the dispatch box again today, the official policy of Her Majesty's government that it will. And I was genuinely puzzled by the Secretary of State when he said, "Yes, I do respect the motion that was moved by my honourable friend and the honourable member for Meriden 2 weeks ago and was passed, but," he said, "my hands are tied by the legislation." Well, I have a message for the Secretary of State. Untie your hands and change that legislation. It is no wonder that the rest of the world looks at this country with utter astonishment and amazement at what we are doing to our economy, our country and our future, and it should not need to be said in this House that our economy, the investment that goes into it and the jobs we hope that our children will get, will depend entirely on the decisions that thousands and thousands of businesses make about their future. And what are we offering them? The Prime Minister got up this week and said, "Hold your nerve." And I think the question we're entitled to ask is, hold our nerve for what? Because it's now more than 2 weeks since the Brady Amendment was passed. It's now more than 2 weeks since the Malthouse Compromise was seized upon like a thirsty man grabs at a drink in the desert. And yet I fear it is a mirage. Because we all know that the search for alternative arrangements to keep an open border in Northern Ireland didn't start 2 weeks ago. It's been going on for about 2 years. And the best minds and the best negotiators and the best brains have searched, but they have not found. Those arrangements do not currently exist. A point that the former Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, made forcefully to our Select Committee when he gave evidence yesterday. And it is why Donald Tusk said yesterday we're still waiting for proposals from the government. I will, of course, give way to my honourable friend.
And further to the point he's making, indeed, last year there was all this discussion about the so-called max-back option, and the European Union rejected that option, which was based on the technology that now is being put forward again.
Well, my honourable friend is, of course, entirely right. And nothing I heard from the Prime Minister on Tuesday, nothing I heard from the Secretary of State from the dispatch box today, persuades me, or I think anyone else, that those alternative arrangements are miraculously going to disappear in the 43 days that remain. I will give way for one more time.
Just a slight nuance on that earlier. The European Union isn't as rude as to say that it rejects it, but it says if your fantasies don't come through, let me have a security policy of a backstop. I don't say your fantasies are wrong, but I'm taking my insurance policy just in case.
Well, the backstop is indeed an insurance policy, and you cannot put a time limit on it, because if it's not there when you need it, it's not an insurance policy. You can't allow one side unilaterally to withdraw from it. And the tragedy here, the tragedy that the backstop illustrates, is we're spending all of this time with something which is necessary because the Prime Minister created the problem in the first place when she announced, casually, probably not thinking through what the consequences were, which have brought her to this point. We're leaving the single market and the customs union. And we're spending barely any time at all, as we have these debates every 2 weeks, on focusing on what is the real problem, which is, as the Father of the House pointed out in his wonderfully eloquent speech, we have no idea what Brexit actually, finally means, because the government has refused to make the choices that confront it, and it has also failed genuinely to reach out across the House. And nothing illustrates that more clearly than the example of a customs union, because I think in her heart the Prime Minister knows that if you want to keep an open border with Northern Ireland, if you want to keep friction-free trade, we are going to have to remain in a customs union with the European Union. And yet she cannot bring herself to confirm this fact, not because it would be economically damaging, it would be quite the opposite, but because it would be politically damaging to the party she leads. Well, it's the Right Honourable Gentleman. I will give way one more time.
Right Honourable Gentleman, I suspect that the Prime Minister knows that the advice from the law officers is that to create a hard border, which follows axiomatically from the policy wanted by my colleagues in the ERG, is a breach of our international legal obligations under the Good Friday Agreement. And as we are a rule of law state, we don't do that sort of thing, which is why, in fact, it's a complete fantasy to try to pursue it.
Well, I can only bow in admiration for the clarity with which the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman has made that point. We know that's where we're going to have to end up, and humouring those who refuse to recognise that is where we're going to end up, while the national interest is being threatened, is not what I regard as leadership we have a right to expect from any government in this country. Now, if the Prime Minister were, even at this late stage, genuinely to reach out, well, I would welcome it. But if she continues to do so, then we are careering towards the cliff. She's at the wheel, and the Cabinet is sitting in the back seat, and at some point they're going to have to decide to lean over and take the steering wheel off her. Because if that does not happen, on whether Parliament is going to take for itself the means to prevent a no-deal exit from the European Union, as long as the government continues to stand at that dispatch box and refuse to give the House the assurance that it is entitled to receive, especially given the motion that was passed 2 weeks ago. And I am one of the proud sponsors of the bill in its new improved form that my Right Honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, has already published, and I will be enthusiastically supporting it in the division lobbies if the amendment is chosen by you, Mr. Speaker, because whatever the differences of view there are in the House about where we should go afterwards, I hope the one thing that will unite us is that almost everybody, not everyone, but almost everyone agrees that we cannot leave with no deal. Now, the final point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is this. I think in most of my previous speeches I've talked about where I would like to go. And I think the fundamental problem is we haven't had a debate about what we want Brexit to look like. And I think that future generations will look in puzzlement at the way in which the negotiations were structured. But since I do believe that one day I will see the Prime Minister stand up there and say I am applying for an extension to Article 50, at that moment the stranglehold of the date of the 29th of March will be broken. The members who have been humoured will discover that they were led a merry dance over their belief that we would in fact leave with no deal on the 29th of March. And the question will then be asked, so what do we use an extension for? And at that moment, we will no longer be able to hide from the choices that need to be made, and I, for one, look forward to that happening.
Thank you. Order. A 6-minute limit now applies. Sir Oliver Letwin.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker, I think it's traditional in the House to say it's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman. In this case, it is a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman, with whose speech I very thoroughly agree. I didn't think, Mr. Speaker, that today's event, unlike that 2 weeks from now, would be of any real interest. I was very wrong, but in a very bad way, because there was a fascinating and rather horrifying series of exchanges before the business began, and then during the opening of the business. And I'm afraid they have driven me finally to a conclusion that I admit over the past few weeks and months I have gradually been forming. And that is, first, that when the chips are down, this government, my government, this Prime Minister, the Prime Minister whom I, unlike many others of my colleagues, voted for when she came for re-election,
yes.
When the chips are down, she will actually prefer to do what some of my esteemed colleagues prefer, and to head for the exit door without a deal,
yep.
which the Secretary of State informed us is the policy of Her Majesty's government,
yep.
in the event
yes.
that her deal has not succeeded. That is a terrifying fact. Yep. Second, Mr. Speaker, I fear I was driven to the final conclusion that it is only by legislation that we are going to resolve this problem, because it is only by legislation that the government will feel compelled to act. It does not accept any motion in this House other than legislation as binding on it, as opposed, as you rightly directed, Mr. Speaker, to orders which order you to take certain actions and order the House to follow certain procedures by the change of standing orders, which have indeed been things we have done in the past few weeks and months successfully. But when it comes to governmental action, I think it is now abundantly clear that only legislation will compel.
Yep.
And the third conclusion I am therefore driven to is that the bill which the Right Honourable Lady and I and others have put forward, which is a successor bill to the previous bill, that delays, or rather commands, the Prime Minister to take a series of actions which will enable her to find out what delay the House commands and what delay the EU is willing to accept, and then to follow that process if she has not achieved a deal by the 13th of March, is a necessary instrument. But beyond that, Mr. Speaker, I'm driven to the conclusion, and that came out, I think, in the conversation that my right honourable friend, the Father of the House, and I briefly had, that we are actually then going to have to do what the opposition Shadow Secretary of State put forward, and what many other honourable members have suggested, namely to find a consensus across this House for a positive alternative, also, alas, by legislation. This is a remarkable condition for Parliament and for government and for this country to find itself in. The structure of our affairs, almost always through our history, since this House first established its rights over against the Crown, has been that the government, Her Majesty's ministers, put forward policy and carry it forward, subject only to the ability first to maintain the confidence of this House, and second, the ability to legislate in this House. It has never previously, in my knowledge, been the practice for this House to have to take control and to direct government policy by legislation. That is an astonishing turn of events. It is, of course I will.
Very grateful to the Right Honourable Member for giving way, and would he like to just reiterate the point that in a fortnight's time, it really is high noon, that there will be no further opportunity to intervene to ensure that this Parliament takes control of the process?
Right Honourable Gentleman, who was a colleague of mine in the coalition government and to whom I pay tribute for his part in taking forward this bill and other measures in which we have jointly engaged, is absolutely right. On the 27th of February, there is no place to hide. This House will, on that date, make a decision which will, I believe, either lead to this country leaving the European Union without a deal, or to delaying the exit of the UK, and therefore give us a chance, if many other things follow, to find an alternative deal that can be agreed by this House, can be legislated through, can be mandated for the government, and can give this country a secure and prosperous future outside the European Union. The 27th of February is the date at which we will have to make that decision. And the final point I want to make is this, Mr. Speaker. These are circumstances under which, being an ordinary Member of Parliament as opposed to a member of the Cabinet, as many of us present here have been in previous cabinets, is no longer the kind of task that many of us have always assumed it would be. And mostly, our country has operated on the principle that the great work of the country is done by governments. And that in this House we have the extraordinary privilege to observe, to inform, to scrutinise, to check, but we don't actually have to take the ultimate responsibility for those crucial decisions which those of us who have served in cabinets and in national security councils have from time to time had to take about what this country does. On the 27th of February and on the 28th of February, if we come to debate that bill, and in succeeding weeks and months as we have to legislate for the policy of this country in relation to the European Union, all of us, each one of us in this House, will suddenly have to take the awesome responsibility for playing our part in trying to find a way through which enables our fellow citizens to have a secure and prosperous future. That is a heavy... Of course I shall.
I'm very grateful to my Right, who makes, as ever, a passionate and quite brilliant speech and a statement of the situation we are in. Could he help us in this respect? Does he believe that the papers of which I've mentioned in my amendment, that they should be published? And would it assist?
I most fervently do believe they should be published. I think there should be much greater information altogether about the no-deal exit, and I would actually vote for my right honourable friend's amendment were it not for the infelicity of the fact that it would knock the government's motion out, to which I am committed for voting, for which I am committed to voting, because I have consistently maintained the position in this House that I will always back the government in its endeavour to get its deal through, until at last it is no longer possible. And maybe I am a romantic, but I have always thought that my task was to try to assist a Conservative government to come to a solution. Papers should be out. And it is because this House is going to be taking, when it comes to legislators, I hope and fear it must, I hope it will and I fear it must, when the House comes to that situation, it will be, so to speak, a cabinet. We will actually be making real-life decisions about what happens to our fellow countrymen, not just legislating in the hope that many years later, subject to further jots and tittles, the law as a whole, as administered by the system of justice, will work better. No, we will actually be making a decision about the future of this country. How can we possibly make those decisions unless we are properly informed? The process of which we are now at the start is a process that will require the fundamental realignment of the relationship between civil service, government and parliament. There is no way we can continue to act as if we were merely a body to which the government is accountable. We will have, in effect, for this purpose, for a period, to take on the government of our country.
Well said.
Chris Leslie.
I applaud the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset for seeking leadership and decisiveness at this particular moment. It makes me ask the question, who to hold responsible for the Groundhog Day moment that we find ourselves in. It's no secret, Mr. Speaker, I regard Brexit as an unmitigated disaster, particularly for my constituents, the most vulnerable, the least well off of my constituents whose jobs and livelihoods are threatened. But I also hold the Prime Minister responsible for the conduct of the negotiations, accepting, as she did, this ridiculous arrangement of the divorce arrangement separated from the future relationship, which should never have been allowed to happen, and then getting into a position of negotiating a deal that, let's face it, nobody really wanted, but she is absolutely determined to prosecute at almost any cost. And now we're in this ridiculous situation of the Prime Minister saying, back me, or we all hold hands and jump off the cliff together. But Brexit isn't just a disaster, Mr. Speaker. Brexit is also a tragedy. And it is a tragedy, yes, because of the economic consequences. We've been talking about the trade deals that were all promised would be already 1 minute after midnight, in fact 1 second after midnight on the 29th of March, and yet we discovered this week that I think only 4 or 5 are going to be ready out of the 40 free trade agreements that are going to be there. We don't know. We do have the Faroe Islands, it is true, but when it comes to Turkey or Japan or South Korea or Canada, they are not going to be ready. So as well as the breach with our largest trading partner, the European Union, you have to add on top of that a breach and a fracture in our trade arrangements with all those other countries too. But it's not just the economic tragedy, because there are other tragedies that my heart breaks at what I think about the history of our country leading up to this moment, working in alliances with our European allies, those citizens' rights that have been accrued, the ability for generations not just to come and work and live and study here, but for our children to do the same reciprocally there. I think about we talk about the backstop as though this nomenclature somehow describes what we're talking about. Let's be more plain about what we're hearing from some honourable members. They don't want a time limit to the backstop. They're essentially arguing for a time limit to open borders between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, a time limit on the Good Friday Agreement. When you put it in those terms, it is preposterous that we should be in this situation at all. So, Mr. Speaker, I do hold the government responsible for getting into this run-the-clock-down strategy. But I have to say, we should be completely honest about why we're in this. I wanted action today. I said earlier on this week it was a delusion that we needed to snap out of absolutely now, because I worry about the time we have to legislate on these things. The reason I will have to cling to the hope of a 27th of February, why are we waiting this period of time? Well, because in order to get the votes for a majority, we have to, of course, work cross-party. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, there have been an increasing number of people on these benches abstaining, even front benchers abstaining, and therefore we have to wait for members of the payroll, government ministers, to do the brave thing and resign, to counteract for the loss of some of those numbers on what should be a solid Labour move against this outrageous situation. The idea that the Labour Party is not together and arguing against this tragedy, against this disaster, is for me entirely heartbreaking. So when I see the amendment put down by the Labour front bench, and I do no longer see those words, option of a public vote, which was there when we had the amendment on the 29th of January, I think to myself, why are we regressing in our party's policy, passed at the September conference? And I know other members put down, in fact I applaud the honourable member for Swansea, the member for Totnes, other honourable members who have tried to put this question of Labour Party policy onto the order paper today. This sort of new euphemism that we found ourselves in, options on the table, how long this table is, when we ever get to these options on the table, it is absolutely not acceptable. And I certainly feel that we are being played for fools by the leadership of the Labour Party on this particular issue, because by now we should have reached the stage of a public vote when it comes to the option of remaining in the European Union, and nobody can explain to me seriously, without being lawyered, why we are not at that particular stage right now. So I would say the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe was correct when he talked about the underlying reasons we are in this mess. Why are we at this Groundhog Day right now? The truth is that our party political system is shattered and it is broken, and it is letting this country down at a crucial time. I believe that it is a moment we needed leadership, but what we are seeing, sadly, is party political calculations, party political advantage, tragically putting themselves ahead of the national interest.
Dame Caroline Spellman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I've been sounding the alarm for the car industry for some time. Of course, their challenges are not just about Brexit, but Brexit has made it worse. Now, many of my constituents have lost their jobs. The claimant count has shot up on my council estate. And given the lagging statistics, I fear this is only going to get worse. Unemployment now at 7.4% compared to the national average of 2.3%. As the 29th of March approaches, it is paramount we leave the EU with a deal. I have voted for the Prime Minister's deal.
Leaving without a deal would be catastrophic. This is not Project Fear. This is reality. These are real people's lives I'm talking about. On Tuesday evening, I co-chaired a meeting with my honourable friend, the member for Erdington, of a wide range of organisations. JLR, Ford, Airbus, Siemens, the CBI, the EEF, the NFU, the Ceramics Association, the Insurers Association, and so on. And the damage of continued uncertainty and the lingering prospect of no deal was made perfectly clear. 80% of the CBI's members have stopped investing in their businesses. The political uncertainty has damaged the UK's credibility as a safe place for investment. One of the large US investors now describes the UK as a problem child of Europe. Against this backdrop, companies of all sizes are finding it increasingly difficult to justify doing business here. Mr. Speaker, when I was growing up, this country was often described as the sick man of Europe, and I really don't want us to become that again. Manufacturers are now spending tens of millions on no-deal preparations, as we heard earlier. It's extraordinary to think that they hope that money is going to be wasted. Manufacturing industry is not in decline. It accounts for 10% of the UK's economic output. The UK is the 9th biggest, not at the moment, manufacturer in the world, and manufacturing is not an industry that this country can afford to lose. It employs thousands of people. It pays well. However, for this success to continue, companies need to be certain the UK is a reliable place to invest and to commit to. And unfortunately, as indicated by Ford's recent announcements, this is now in doubt. I give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and she and my honourable friend have done quite a remarkable job in getting all these various organisations together. And like her, I'm concerned because, as she knows, I've got Jaguar Land Rover, a number of other companies in Coventry, and the local CBI have contacted me, voicing concern about the direction we're heading in relation to these negotiations. I hope she'll agree with me about that.
Speaker, West Midlands MPs across the political divide have sounded the alarm together for the jobs that are put at risk. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to bring a fresh example to you of those at stake. We often speak about the economic cost, but there's a huge human cost. And as Second Church Estates Commissioner, I was approached by the Bishop of Europe. Yes, the Church of England has a diocese of Europe. There are approximately 1 million citizens living in the UK. Many are pensioners. 250,000 of them are estimated to be receiving ongoing healthcare treatment. In addition, there are 50 million visitors from the UK annually to the continent. They're covered by the health insurance guard. Indeed, 27 million are registered as having one, maybe some of us. But that provision is at stake in a no-deal Brexit. Permanent employees and residents are covered by an S1 certificate, which enables healthcare treatments to be reimbursed in the EEA and Switzerland. But that too is at stake from a no-deal Brexit. I give way.
For giving way, and she's absolutely right. This uncertainty is causing huge problems for the British community, but also for businesses. But does she not agree with me that many businesses, even though I voted against the government's deal, actually welcome the withdrawal agreement, and what they're saying is indecision rather than Brexit per se that is stalling businesses now, and what we need is to agree a deal without further delay?
So, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree, and please heed businesses who say the deal may not be perfect, but it's good enough. And it's the jobs that are at stake as the uncertainty continues. But, Mr. Speaker, we're straying into economics again. I want to come back to human cases. Consider the 91-year-old man in an Italian nursing home. His son, who lives here, has just had a letter from the Italian authorities to say they will no longer pay for his father's care from the 30th of March if there's no deal. Imagine the younger man, worried sick he can't afford those nursing home fees, and that moving his father could be fatal. Then consider the young man living and working in France with HIV. He's just received a letter to say on March the 30th he'll have to pay for his own antiretroviral treatment. And listen to the voices of 2 pensioners living in Spain. I'll have to return to Britain as without healthcare paid for, I can't afford to live here. I wasn't allowed to vote in the referendum, and if we don't get the healthcare costs paid for us, we'll have to come home. Now, the government tells them it's negotiating reciprocal rights. London and Madrid have already signed a deal ensuring voting rights and working rights for respective migrants, but healthcare is not part of this agreement. I wrote to the Secretary of State for Health last week. I hadn't yet had a reply. I stopped him in the lobbies to ask about this, and he pointed out that the reciprocal healthcare bill is being debated in the Lords. But will it have passed both houses by March the 30th? More importantly, I won't give way again. More importantly, will other countries hosting UK citizens have legislated in their parliaments to protect them? Mr. Speaker, these are real people, real lives. Sick and vulnerable people have become caught up in the Brexit turmoil. They need help and they need answers. I therefore, until I heard the interpretation of it today, I was going to welcome the motion by the Prime Minister, which actually supported the amendments which were passed by a majority in this House. I'm not entirely happy with the demotion, it appears, of my own amendment. So, I've consistently supported the Prime Minister's deal, and I will continue to support her to get a deal agreed in this House. Businesses need to know what position they will be in after the 29th of March. Our country had barely recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. Politicians in this place did not have a choice of avoiding that global slump. We were on the brink of a similar shock to our economy in the form of no deal. But this time, it is in our power to avoid doing such damage. We must leave the EU to honour the result of the referendum, but we must ensure we do this in a way that will not decimate the livelihoods of thousands across the nation. I will be voting for the Prime Minister's motion tonight, but I do implore colleagues to get behind the deal and secure the jobs and livelihoods that are so precious to those of us we represent.
Speaker, the Prime Minister's own personal approach to Brexit has created what 40 former ambassadors today have rightly called a national crisis, which she's presiding over. And I think the serious and important speeches from the Right Honourable Members for Rushcliffe, Broxtowe, Nottingham East, Pontefract and Castleford, Leeds North West, West Dorset and the Right Honourable Lady for Meriden have risen to the occasion of the crisis which is now facing us. I only wish that the Government Minister, in his initial opening of this debate, could have risen to it as well. But the fact is that the Prime Minister, from the beginning, has chosen to put the interests of keeping the Conservative Party together over the national interest. So she has chosen, because she's decided to kowtow to the extremists in her own party, a hard Brexit to get through her own party conference, which she didn't even discuss with her own cabinet. She set the hard red lines out of the single market, out of the customs union, which created the problems with the Irish backstop. And from the beginning, she made no attempt to forge a consensus across party lines or indeed across the country to define what Brexit would be, so it could be delivered in a consensus way rather than a way which has exacerbated disunity and further divided this nation. She has decided that she has to deliver Brexit with Conservative and DUP votes and nothing else to keep her party together and avoid a split. So this has pushed her to a harder and more damaging conclusion than she might have reached if she'd have reached out, and it will do our country more damage. By her choices, the Prime Minister has further divided the country. She's not sought unity, and we are all paying the price. Mr. Speaker, unity does not consist merely of being forced to agree with her dubious partisan choices and her definition of what Brexit should be, which are reckless in the extreme. In choosing, I'm happy to give it.
She also takes the view that given the result of the general election, which resulted in a hung parliament, which resulted in the Conservative Party actually losing its majority, there is no argument that there is any mandate for a hard Brexit. In fact, if there's any mandate, it's against a hard Brexit, against no deal.
Not to my surprise, I find myself agreeing with the observations of the Honourable Lady. The only poll nationally that the Prime Minister talks about these days is the referendum. Somehow she never refers to the 2017 election in which her party lost its mandate for a hard Brexit. And the response to the result of that vote in 2017 and the loss of the majority surely ought to have been to go for a softer, more consensual Brexit, which would have kept us in the customs union and avoided all these problems. But instead we have a Prime Minister that characterises disagreement with her own particular partisan choices on Brexit as if it's a betrayal of democracy. She has used those words, and that has further exacerbated the anger that we have in this country, and it, in my view, is actually beginning more. So she is being reckless with our political stability. She has ignored Parliament in the way in which she has gone about delivering Brexit. She allowed her attack dogs to attack judges who pointed out, in fact, that Parliament needed to have a say about the triggering of Article 50 in the first place. And indeed, she has allowed her government to be found in contempt of Parliament. Today's motion only exists because she was defeated in an attempt to shut down Parliament's say in Brexit, and yet the government are fulfilling the terms of that vote by holding this debate according to the letter and not the spirit of the defeat they suffered. They routinely ignore votes in Parliament. Opposition days have simply disappeared, and they don't deign to vote in divisions that the opposition get anyway, much less do they take any notice of the result. We're seeing the phrase non-binding on the government increasingly applied, which is why I made the point of order I did at the beginning of the speech. This is a development which had been unthinkable when I came into the House. The very unwritten rules that are about our Constitution are now beginning to be ignored. Political gravity, that was always thought to be something that everybody would respect, is being ignored. It's the letter, not the spirit, of our Constitution and our law which is now apparently more important. We will rue the day we went down this dangerous path. All agreements are intra-conservative ones. The Chequers agreement was with the Cabinet, and that didn't last the weekend. The ludicrously named Malthouse Compromise, already ruled out by the EU. The Alternative Arrangements Working Party, funded by civil service support, all about trying to get the rabble of the ERG to agree with the rest of the Conservative Party so she can move forwards, all to kick the can down the road and let her stay in office another week. The Prime Minister is deeply reckless, and she's made a deeply reckless decision to play a hugely damaging game of brinkmanship with her own party by threatening the entire country with no deal. And we've heard in the powerful speeches we've had so far in this debate the real effect that that is having, the real damage that that is doing to our country, trashing our international reputation abroad, doing irreparable damage to our standing in the world, diminishing our standing, going to the brink in pursuit of all of no deal, is reckless with our economic prosperity in the future, and it's been reckless with our political stability. Jobs are being lost now. Investment opportunities are being lost now. Growth is being sacrificed now. The Prime Minister has allowed the Tory Eurosceptic virus to infect the entire body politic. We're all ill with it. We're being weakened with it. Her and her party will never be forgiven for the damage that she is causing.
Henry Smith.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be called to speak in this important EU withdrawal debate, and particularly after so many impassioned speeches from the front bench to the back benches. It's almost exactly 3 years ago that it was confirmed that the EU membership referendum was going to take place in June, and of course June 2016, and of course it's over 2.5 years now since that referendum took place. In my constituency, the decision to leave the European Union was 58%, and of course across the country as a whole it was 52%. Since that time, as the Honourable Lady before has just mentioned, we have had a general election in 2017 where I understand 589 now elected Right Honourable and Honourable members of this House stood on a manifesto commitment to deliver the result of that referendum. The message I have, and just the other day I was walking down a local shopping parade, tailgate parade in my constituency, and typically, as is the case, somebody came up to me and wanted to know about the current Brexit debates in Parliament and said, why aren't we just getting on with the decision that we made just over 2.5 years ago? And that is a compelling argument. Now, we have heard earlier on this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, about calls for a so-called people's vote. I would argue we had a people's vote in 2016. We've also heard calls for an extension to Article 50 to delay our departure from the European Union. What we have also heard from those honourable members is the concern about uncertainty of Brexit. The one thing that will maintain and continue uncertainty is by questioning the democratic decision again that was taken in a second referendum. That would certainly do a lot to damage our democracy and prolong uncertainty, as would a delay to Article 50 before we even get into the issues of whether the remaining 27 members of the EU would allow Article 50 to be extended, and the issue again that's been highlighted, Mr. Speaker, by honourable and right honourable members of EU elections should we go beyond July if Article 50 were to be extended. Mention has also been made that we should be taking no deal off the table. I have never known a negotiation where one party goes in and says that they will walk, they're not willing to walk away from that negotiation. I hear some jeering from the opposition benches, many of whom are sponsored by trade unions. I can't imagine a trade union going into a negotiation with an employer saying that they wouldn't be willing. They wouldn't be willing to strike in those negotiations. I'm happy to give way to the honourable gentleman.
The problem with this walk-away analogy is that in any other negotiation, when you walk away, the status quo applies. That is not the case here. When we walk away from this, a whole new and terribly damaging set of new things come into force. That's why this analogy with a business deal is so fatuous, ridiculous and wrong.
I'm very grateful that the honourable gentleman has mentioned the status quo, because I don't think the status quo of remaining inside the European Union is good for this country. The European Union is increasingly a protectionist bloc. The European Union is not outward and global in its approach. This country, with its unique global links, can use those to have a much more positive future instead of locking itself into the ever closer union, that is producing a demographic deficit at the heart of the EU, and not even to mention things like a European army. I'm delighted to give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, my friend. He very clearly makes the point that we didn't vote for this. We did not vote for the status quo. It's quite clear 17.4 million people voted to leave. Would he agree with me that the inevitable outcome, if we don't have a deal, is no deal? That is not the status quo.
I think we've seen people in this country reject the status quo, and I actually see Brexit as an opportunity for wider constitutional reform about devolving power, about changing the way the other place works fundamentally, and many other aspects as well. People did want change. I think actually throughout Europe, throughout many EU member states, there is a real desire for there to be change. And I think if we don't respect that democratic decision, then some of the civil unrest that we've seen on the streets of Paris and Lyon and Marseille, and some of the economic contraction that we see in Germany and the crisis in countries like Italy will be visited on this country. I'll be happy to give way to my honourable friend from Dover.
My honourable friend is making a typically very powerful speech. Can you think of anything more craven than for members of this House to vote one day to trigger Article 50 and then to say 2 years later, oh, we didn't mean to do that, we need to carry on? Isn't that just craven and frankly pathetic?
We've seen significant majorities both in favour of leaving the European Union in terms of around about 80% of members of Parliament elected at the last general election who said they would follow through on. I don't have any time, I do apologise. Actually, yes, I will give way very briefly.
I wonder if my honourable friend could remind us of the promise that was made by the Leave campaign that he supported, which repeatedly said that we would not leave the European Union until a trade deal securing our future trading relationship with the EU had been secured. Does he remember those broken promises?
Well, I never made that promise in my supporting leaving the European Union. I do believe that a deal is the best way forward, but let's not forget that the vast majority of honourable right honourable members in this House voted for the legislation to leave the European Union on March the 29th, and if no deal is the result of that, that is the default position of the legislation. I will give very briefly.
Thank you very much for reminding us of what was said in the past. Of course, in the Conservative Party manifesto that I stood in 2017, it stated very clearly that we will seek a deep and special partnership with the EU, including a new free trade agreement and including a customs agreement. Does he still stand by that promise?
Yes, we absolutely should be seeking and honouring a deep and close relationship with our neighbours and allies in Europe. But the trouble with a customs union, which the side opposite are advocating, is that it would actually prevent us from doing those global free trade deals, which actually is the key in a world that is getting smaller to our prosperity. The key, I think, to this country's future prosperity is our unique global links and being a conduit to our proximity to Europe. And we need to be robust in those ongoing negotiations, and I support the Prime Minister in continuing those ongoing negotiations. I have never known an EU negotiation not go down to the last moment. And with that, I remain optimistic about our futures. And for goodness sake, Mr. Speaker, we should be more optimistic as a House and as a country, because our best years are ahead of us.
Anna McLaurin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In just 43 days' time, we're set out to crash out with no deal. Yet the Prime Minister and this front bench opposite insist on running down the clock, giving a completely false choice. No deal versus Theresa May's bad deal. We know that the motion here today is non-binding. So why, Mr. Speaker? Why are we here to discuss the chaos that this government has got us into, just days from the biggest disaster that we are facing as a country, that we are facing in a generation? Just days. And before and after the votes 2 weeks ago, this House knew that the EU were not prepared to move on amending the withdrawal agreement. Yet still the Prime Minister insists on going back to Brussels to ask again and again, running down the clock. The one thing that this House has been consistently clear on is that the majority of members do not want this Prime Minister's deal. And neither, in my view, do they want a no deal. Nobody wants a no deal. So why is this the option? Why are we facing a no deal just 43 days before we are set to crash out? Why are we being blackmailed by this Prime Minister into voting for her deal to avoid a no deal? A Prime Minister pursuing her policy of brinkmanship, trying to scare MPs into voting for her deal. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, that this will not work. We will not be blackmailed. This shouldn't be about the Tory party, not then, not now, and not ever. The referendum was called back by the then Prime Minister, is now an embarrassment. The Prime Minister is a laughingstock. And all over the world, we are being watched. And I'm afraid that what they see is chaos. A weak Prime Minister unable to control her own party, and a government about to commit an act of such self-harm that it will take years, if not generations, for us to recover, economically and socially, in our communities and our businesses. Far from being outward-looking, confident and strong country, leaving the European Union pursuing a policy of isolationism.
My friend, give way.
I'll give way.
On that point, haven't we as a member of the European Union been at the forefront of combating climate change through the UN process? Isn't leaving actually going to take us back? Shouldn't we actually be looking for a Marshall Plan environment across Europe, not just ourselves?
I thank my honourable friend for that excellent point. Yes, this government, in tearing apart all of these brilliant policies that we are in partnership with the European Union, the fabric of this country, bit by bit. But also dismissing the rights of people who've lived here for years and years, damaging our businesses, damaging our communities and damaging our public services. And I was not elected to this place to make my constituents poorer, to make my constituents less safe, which is what we are set to do. And that's what we would be doing by voting for this Prime Minister's deal, or any deal, or worse, crashing out with no deal. And yet, Mr. Speaker, we are lacking that leadership, the courage and commitment we need from our political leaders to demonstrate that they're putting the people of this country first, to stand up for what is right, not to risk security and peace in Northern Ireland. The backstop is essential to ensure peace in that part of the world. There is no such thing as alternative arrangements. We all know that, and our EU friends are absolutely right to stay firm on this. It's only an irresponsible government that will seek changes to this, running down the clock. And it's our communities, our constituents that will suffer. Their jobs, their livelihoods that will suffer. Hard-working families, small and large businesses. Many I speak to in Cardiff North are so worried about their future. A deli I was in my constituency of Cardiff North just last week, run by Italians. They've been there for years. They are very worried, not only about trade, but about their own futures. A florist round the corner from my office, worried about her future and her family's future. Why are we doing this to the people of this country? Yet this Secretary of State says, hold our nerve. Hold our nerve for what? This is a sham of a negotiation. We're in this situation because of this government. My constituents don't want this. And while jobs are under threat, Ford and Airbus threatening to leave, small businesses worried about their future, and my constituents worried about their future and the future for their children. And do you know what's more? They are deeply, deeply saddened by the state of this country, saddened by the lack of future that this government is giving their children. A fantasy future based on nothing but lies and deception. from that Leave campaign. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm saddened too. But more than that, I'm deeply, deeply worried. Worried that this Prime Minister is playing recklessly with this country's future. We must urgently take action to reject and prevent no deal. We must immediately extend Article 50 and then put this deal, whatever deal it is, back to the people for that final say. That is the only proper democratic solution that we can find a way forward on this. If the Prime Minister is so sure of her deal, then that's what she'll do. Put her deal back to the people for a final say.
Sir William Cash.
Speaker, the two previous motions, one in the name of the member for Altrincham and the other in the name of the member for Meriden, are both incorporated in this government motion. As respects the first, there's been no realistic suggestion of a credible replacement of the backstop at all since the motion was passed, and the EU are still saying they won't renegotiate. There is no withdrawal agreement simply because it has not been signed. And in that context, the Brady motion was meaningless. Furthermore, as I said to the Prime Minister on Tuesday, Article 4 of the current draft withdrawal agreement undermines control over our own laws, which will create uncompetitive havoc for businesses and for trade unionists and for workers as the laws are passed by the other 27 member states as they go through the Council of Ministers, and we won't even be there. It also contradicts the repeal of Section 1 of the Withdrawal Act 2018 and the repeal of the European Community Act 1972. I'll certainly give way.
Were we to make the mistake of saying we rule out leaving without signing the withdrawal agreement, we take away the main bargaining card the government has to get improvements to that agreement.
It is absolutely right. My honourable friend is right. As to the Meriden amendment, the Prime Minister, in a reply to my question on Tuesday, which she agreed with, was that members from across the House voted for Article 50 within a 2-year timeline on it, ending on the 29th of March, and that every Conservative member had voted for the Withdrawal Act. She was right. However, the member for Meriden's amendment only passed because it was supported by members from all parties who had already voted for the Withdrawal Act, the Notification Act and the Referendum Act, and were effectively undermining their previous votes on the Prime Minister's own analysis. Furthermore, we were whipped against the Meriden motion itself. There was no consultation prior to the tabling of the government motion before the House today. In any case, the government's position is clear that a so-called no deal remains on the table, and the Secretary of State confirmed that. But this motion makes no sense. So why are we being faced with this today? We are told that it is to keep traction with the EU, who have been, as I said on Tuesday to the Prime Minister, both undemocratic and totally intransigent. The withdrawal agreement itself, as I've said, is inconsistent with the European Community Act 1972. It is therefore inconsistent also with the referendum itself, our manifesto, because the Withdrawal Act includes the repudiation in UK law of all EU laws and treaties, and Article 4 of the withdrawal agreement is completely inconsistent with this. A vast number of our voters see through this charade. They see through this smoke and mirrors, and in particular, so too do the Conservative Party membership. A recent Conservative home poll showed that 70% of these were against the withdrawal agreement. The real problem here goes back to what I said on the first vote on the withdrawal agreement and my observations about the failure of the public trust in respect to the Chequers deal and this withdrawal agreement. These stand as much today as when I spoke on the 15th of January. This motion today further undermines public trust. We are now truly entering the world of George Orwell's Ministry of Truth. In his book 1984, Orwell said, "Doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them." This double motion is double-thinking action, and I cannot possibly vote for it.
Hal Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister asks us to hold our nerve, to give her time. One has to ask more time for what, and the answer is unclear, other than the obvious one that it is in order to run down the clock towards early March. And despite the furious denials, that seems increasingly clear, as we have heard this afternoon. The Prime Minister, it seems, cannot move an inch without enraging one faction or other of her own party. Now, Brexit is problematic, but at present the problem is not the Irish, and it's certainly not the Scots, nor, for that matter, the supine Welsh government. It's not the backstop. I think the problem is clearly in their own party, and it is unsupportable that we are being led to this disaster for that very reason. We are encouraged to keep our nerve whilst the wrangling proceeds, whilst the obfuscation for party advantage proceeds, to keep our nerve, to keep our seats, whilst outside the bubble people are losing their jobs. We keep our nerve, they lose their jobs. And I will give a practical example, in fact. A small castings company in my constituency, an exporting company with products of the very highest quality, committed to the community where they were established and which they serve, and from where they get their workforce. And the last time I talked to them, they are now looking at establishing a distribution centre in the Netherlands because they can't face the confusion that now oppresses them. That's only 4 jobs. But for that community and for that company, 4 jobs is a huge loss. And 4 jobs repeated endlessly across all the countries of these islands is a huge, huge burden which we could avoid. After many years of representing Carnarvon and then the Arfon constituency, I've come to recognise the signs of a government in desperate straits. And I think we now have some more signs to add to the list. Major government defeats, crucial votes delayed without reason, a recess cancelled for no more than a few statutory instruments and a few general debates. And as my honourable friend Fodwyfor Meirionnydd said yesterday, this is a broken Britain, its democracy stumbling, its economy unbalanced towards the south-east of England, and inequality continuously amplified. From the outside, the bickering and the jostling here, the bickering and jostling for position, it really does seem to be entirely unreasonable and irrelevant to their everyday lives. It is ignoring of a basic point which drives me and my party. Any form of Brexit would leave Wales and indeed the whole of the rest of the UK worse off economically. I can see that most well-to-do people who occupy the benches in Parliament will probably be okay, probably fine in the Brexit. But my constituents, working people, factory workers, students, retired people, families and children will not. Now, I'd just like to confirm that my party will be voting for the amendments and against the government's motion. But, Mr. Speaker, forgive me for finishing on a familiar note, repeating what my party has said over and over again as Brexit's day looms. The reasonable solution for the Prime Minister is to reject no deal emphatically and then put her own deal in whatever form that is, put her own deal to a vote for the people to have a final say.
Well said. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great pleasure to follow the honourable member for Arfon. I'm afraid, while I agree with Wales and voting to leave the EU, I'm afraid I found little in his speech, though he put it powerfully and coherently, that I could agree with. I certainly can't agree with the second referendum, or indeed for taking no deal off the table. Mr. Speaker, I've always found in the House it's a good idea to vote on what the motion says and not necessarily what ministers or other members say in the House. So I thought I'd better have a look at what it said today. And it's very clear, actually. It says, this House reiterates its support for the approach to leaving the EU expressed by this House on the 29th of January 2019. So I thought I'd better look and see what the House had agreed to. And within that motion that the House agreed to were the words, "rejects the United Kingdom leaving the European Union without a withdrawal agreement." In other words, the motion we are voting on tonight takes no deal off the table. It doesn't matter what ministers have said, it's what the motion says. So I would expect all honourable members on the other side, who don't seem to want a no-deal option, to support the government's motion tonight, which is exactly the reason I will not be supporting the government's motion tonight. It is a badly worded motion. Well, no, it's not a badly worded, Mr. Speaker. It's deliberately worded that way. And I think the government thought they should slide it through and it wouldn't matter. I know, sir, that if I supported this tonight, the whips would point out to me that you've supported taking no deal off the table. That is not what I can do. I want to go back, Mr. Speaker, to when I was a co-founder of the Grassroots Out movement. I travelled the length and breadth of the United Kingdom during the referendum campaign, discussing with people what they wanted if they were going to vote to leave. And it came down to, I think, to a few things. They wanted to end the free movement of people. They wanted to stop giving billions and billions of pounds each and every year to the EU. And they wanted to make our own laws in our own country judged by our own judges. I fear that all those tests fell on the current withdrawal agreement proposed by the government. And maybe that's one of the reasons it had the biggest defeat in Commons history. Now, if you have the biggest defeat in Commons history, Mr. Speaker, I think you might want to go away and think very carefully about what you put to the House and not tinker around for a couple of weeks and come back and put more or less the same motion. Because the same thing will happen. It will get rejected by this House. If we look at the tests, does the withdrawal agreement end the free movement of people? Well, it doesn't, because there is no future deal worked out. There's some sort of political wish list, a political declaration. So it fails on that score. Does the agreement stop billions and billions of pounds being given to the EU each and every year? Well, we know that £39 billion is going to be given whatever happens under the withdrawal agreement, and if the transition period is extended, even more money is being given. Clearly, our courts are not going to be able to be the final arbiters, because the European Court of Justice has a significant say over our future. Of course.
Will you confirm that because it isn't an agreement about the future partnership, it sentenced this House and the whole nation to 21 to 45 more months of the roused disagreements, uncertainties and problems we presided over for the last 2 years, 7 months?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful for my right honourable friend's intervention, and I just deal with that issue. I will deal with that issue in a minute. I just wanted to finish off in saying that clearly the withdrawal agreement doesn't let us make our own laws in our own country, because we would still be tied to the European Union. But the one thing that people say, and I hear it from leading Remainers, is we want certainty. The one thing that the withdrawal agreement gives you, and the political declaration in particular, is uncertainty. Months and months and months of squabbling and not delivering what the British people voted for in June 2016, of course.
Does he agree with me that it would be most useful that before the conclusion of tonight's debate that we heard from the front bench of the government the draft textual legal changes that are binding, have they been drafted and have they been put to Europe?
Very grateful for that intervention from, may I say, the very sound colleagues on the DUP benches, and of course that exactly would help enormously. But I do think where everyone says no deal, cliff edge, disaster, people didn't vote to make themselves poorer, is complete and utter nonsense. No, it's not rubbish, it's nonsense. But you can use the word rubbish as well. Whichever one you like, it's rubbish or nonsense. You say, I'm talking nonsense. Well, that's because I listened to the Honourable Lady and she made a powerful Remain speech. It was just an absolute, let's use one of those words, nonsense. The truth of the matter is that the British people had the Cameron Osborne Project fear thrown at them. They were told it would be the end of the world if they voted to come. They would be poorer. House prices would either go up or down. Interest rates would go through the roof. There'd be mass unemployment, even bubonic plague. And they still voted for it. So I'm afraid people in this Remain Parliament are ignoring the wishes of the British people. And with the exception of a very few members, none of the members who spoke mentioned the British people. They all mentioned themselves and what they wanted. Sorry, did you say shut up? If the Honourable Lady suggested that point, I'm going to shut up very shortly, and I'm sure we'll hear from her certainly. But I tell you this.
Just stop the clock. I say in the most affectionate possible terms to the Honourable Gentleman, Madam, but Huddersfield is an extremely cerebral member of this House, that at this moment he is behaving like an incorrigible delinquent, and I urge him to desist from this disorderly behaviour. He's fundamentally a very good man, some would even say a great man, but something has seized him today, and he's behaving in a mildly eccentric manner. But who cares? Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure you, sir, I'm not a snowflake, so I won't take offence from him. The truth is that a no-deal Brexit, which of course is a deal coming out on WTO rules, is the answer. It gives clarity to business and it delivers what the British people voted for in June 2016.
Drew me.
Mr. Speaker, poverty drove my parents to emigrate from rural Ireland to this country. This country gave them everything. And I never thought when I was a snotty kid in Kilburn that I'd ever end up as a Member of Parliament. I'm proud of our country, truly Great Britain. And it grieves me now to see our country facing the biggest crisis since 1945 as a consequence of a self-inflicted wound as we drift towards an abyss into which, if we plunge without a deal to protect the British national interest, our country will be the poorer for a generation to come. Now, on the 29th of January, the House spoke. The motion put forward by the truly honourable, right honourable member for Meriden, who I praise in the warmest possible terms for her outstanding integrity, and we put forward that motion, no to no deal. The House spoke. That led to constructive all-party negotiations commencing. Today we heard not one word from the Secretary of State about progress in those negotiations, as he pandered unashamedly to the European Research Group, those who are oblivious to the consequences of their actions. Like, for example, the Right Honourable Member for North East Somerset, when it was put to him about the difficulties there would be for the automotive industry, including the Jaguar plant in my constituency, in relation to frictionless trade in particular, he said, frictionless trade, fake news, fake news. So he knows more about how to make cars than those who make cars. Right honourable members opposite who pretend they know more about how to build ships and planes than those who build ships and planes, that they know more than somehow the head of counter-terrorism, who warns of potentially the very serious consequences for the safety and security of our citizens unless we crash out, if we crash out with a deal.
But my honourable friend, I thank you for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech. Does he remember well the words made by the honourable member for Uxbridge when he said,
F business. And is that not the attitude that seems to be pervading this place in terms of what happens on the other side of Brexit? It's almost a don't care, but it will seriously damage our communities.
From the party of business.
The Honourable Member makes a really powerful point. F business, Jaguar Land Rover, the Jaguar plant in my constituency, the Land Rover plant in Meriden, in her constituency, that's transformed the lives of tens of thousands of workers locally, and the riposte from the ERG is to say F business, absolutely disgraceful.
Disgraceful.
Now, we are determined to press forward regardless with making these talks, positive talks, with a view to trying to reach agreement. Why? Not least because of what we were told on Tuesday night at a meeting that we organised here. The 5 biggest manufacturing companies, in addition, interest from food, finance, farming, all speaking with one voice. We cannot crash out without a deal, and we want a good deal to protect the British national interest. Some of the things they said, the effects of no deal are happening now. American investors in manufacturing companies now see us as the problem child of Europe. Halved. Automotive companies planning shutdowns after the 29th of March. Businesses being told by their contractors to build up 3 months' worth of stock after the 29th of March, costing them a small fortune, using up valuable storage space. And as the NFU said, 90% of animal vaccines are imported. In a no-deal scenario, they cannot guarantee necessary vaccines will be readily available.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Whilst he reads out those statistics about the problems, the fact of the matter is, in Northern Ireland, which he referenced, we have the lowest on record unemployment ever in the history of the state of Northern Ireland, the highest number of inward and direct investment ever in the history of Northern Ireland, and indeed the joint total of our export sales to the rest of the United Kingdom and to the rest of the world is more than 73% of everything we produce. The fact is, this is where we make our money.
In the EU, come to Erdington, where we still have 1 in 10 who are out of work, with unemployment rising. When we turned around the Jaguar plant from closure in 2010, it doubled in size from 1,400 to 3,300. It's now lost 1,000 jobs in the last 12 months, and growing uncertainty is seeing more and more jobs losses. And these are good jobs, secure jobs, well-paid jobs, now being put at risk by Brexit. And it is nothing short of extraordinary that there continues to be too many honourable members in this House who are just oblivious to the consequences of their actions. Now, the week commencing the 25th of March will be crunch time for government, for our country and for businesses up and down the country. Let's make this absolutely clear. Notwithstanding some of the things that have been said opposite, that motion, no to no deal, that we won on the 29th of March, with parties across this House uniting together, that stands. It is morally binding. It would be utterly contemptuous of government if they were to give 2 fingers to that clearly expressed wish of the House of Commons. But today tells us, dare I say it, in some of the extraordinary contributions that we've heard, today tells us that a safeguard is necessary at the next stages. We will, I stress once again, engage positively, formally and informally with the negotiations underway with a view to reaching agreement, because we believe we have a duty to put the British national interest first. But if given what we've heard today, it reinforces our view that we have to support that Cooper-Letwin bill, because that's an utterly essential measure that the Right Honourable Member for Meriden and myself have both signed and strongly support. It underpins, it's a safeguard that prevents us from crashing over a cliff on the 29th of March without a deal. If I can say this in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we've got a sacred duty in this House, a sacred duty to put the national interest first. I always, when I get out of bed every morning, what drives me forward is those that I represent, the lives transformed because of successful companies. And I grieve at the thought of what is unfolding. So we have to come together across this House in the best interest of Britain and in the best traditions of Britain to agree a deal that will protect Britain at the next stages. It would be utterly outrageous if we were to betray the trust of the British people, and we, for one, just will not do it.
Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman from Birmingham Erdington, and I agreed entirely with the sentiments he expressed about the depth of this crisis. Of course, when it comes to understanding how we've got ourselves here, I do still think that we need a little bit of reflection. After the referendum, I spent at least the first 12 months trying to persuade myself that there was some silver lining to the cloud. That some of the arguments that we might eventually find a better destiny outside of the EU without so much of the interference and anger and debate that took place about our participation might somehow be in our interests. But the truth and the reason why we find ourselves where we are is that apart from a small minority of this House who are absolutely fixated and persuaded that we can part company with our nearest neighbours in their entirety, that apart from them, the truth, uttered not always in this chamber but certainly in the tea room, is that an overwhelming majority of members of Parliament believe that Brexit, in whatever form it takes, is going to be damaging to this country. Doesn't matter whether it's Norway or Norway Plus or the palliative, which might be seen as a palliative that presents, or a Canada-style agreement, or indeed the agreement negotiated in good faith by my right honourable friend the Prime Minister. They are all inferior to participation. And the result is we are tying ourselves up in knots, and that is why we're paralysed. And we end up either with people trying to have their cake and eat it, like my right honourable friend the member for Uxbridge, or if I say gently, the Labour front bench that has bought a plastic cake and pretends it's edible, rather than coming to the correct conclusion that in fact, which is I believe what we are going to have to do eventually, that we are going to have to go back to the public with the options, pointing out the limitations on what happened in 2016 and ask them if in fact some of the ones we can deliver can in fact be delivered. Otherwise we should not be doing it. And that's where we have to end up. But in the meantime the crisis deepens and we have the extraordinary sight of being told that in fact we have to continue negotiating and threatening to leave, when threatening to leave is frankly the behaviour of a 3-year-old who says they're going to hold their breath if they don't get given the toy they want. And that is where we are. And we are now going to have to do something about it ourselves if we are going to get ourselves out of this mess, because I agree so much with my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, we cannot allow this to happen. That is why I've signed the bill he's presented. That is why I will work with him to get it through Parliament. And that is why I believe it is the only way out of the current crisis. But I will just say this before I sit down, Mr. Speaker, because I want to conclude quickly. What does trouble me is that my right honourable friends on the front bench should be doing this themselves of their own motion. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, talks about her sacred duty over Brexit. But surely, I don't think Brexit is a sacred duty at all. I think it's a pretty profane matter. But I have to say that to plunge us into a national crisis seems to me to be that we have a sacred duty to prevent it. And I am therefore really alarmed that I find that she does not appear to understand that. And I have to say to my right honourable friends and honourable friends on the front bench, if that is the policy on which they are going to persist, then obviously we will try to change it by implementing the necessary legislation. But it calls into question whether, in fact, the government, which I do my best to support despite the problems we've got, is in fact acting in the national interest at all. And I simply say to them that there is going to come a time when my ability to support this government is going to run out completely if we continue behaving in this absolutely crazy fashion. The national interest calls on us to face up to our responsibilities, and that is what we have got to do.
After the honourable member for Wirral South, the time limit will have to be reduced with immediate effect to 4 minutes, because I want to get in as many colleagues as possible. Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is truly an honour to follow the honourable gentleman. I want to begin, Mr. Speaker, by making a brief comment. I was in Belfast and Bangor last week, and I met many people who felt that they had been forgotten by this House, not by their own members of Parliament, but by the House at large. And I want to say to them that they have not, and they will be, not forgotten. And equally, members of the Irish community in Liverpool said similarly to me over the weekend, and I say the same to them. We will not forget the Good Friday Agreement, and we will do everything to protect it. That said, I agree, Mr. Speaker, perhaps surprisingly, with the member for Wellingborough. He said that he is against the deal because it offers absolutely no certainty for the future and simply continues this charade for years and years to come. And, Mr. Speaker, he is absolutely correct. And I want to say very briefly some comments about the politics and about the economics of the situation we face. And first, the politics. We have seen in the past 24 hours, with the behaviour of the ERG, an absolute disgrace. They are only interested in their own power. They do not, Mr. Speaker, want a deal of any kind. They want to lead the government and our country on a dance. That is what they want. And until we all realise that, we will be kept going round and round this roundabout. The deal makers in this House, Mr. Speaker, are over here on these benches. It is unsurprising that people who come from the Labour movement should know how to negotiate and do a deal, and the government should have always looked to us. But we have been ignored because we are simply pawns in a game with the players who are fighting not for our country but over the soul of the Tory party. Now, I have some sympathy with those on the Labour benches who do want to find a deal, but we come back to the problem that the member for Wellingborough pointed out. That anything that's in the political declaration about the future framework is frankly pie in the sky. It answers no questions, and what's more, as the Prime Minister has demonstrated to us all, it is very difficult to take her at her word. It is incredibly difficult to trust the Tories. That said, Mr. Speaker, on the economics, the problems are even more profound. Economists talk about sunk costs. Things you spend money on that seemed like a good idea but turn out to be a bad idea. And in that sense, Mr. Speaker, Brexit is now a sunk cost. We have been spending money hand over fist on no-deal preparations that we hope that we'll never need, just in case. But in fact, in economic terms, no deal is already happening. The disinvestment is already happening. Currency shifts are already costing us in terms of inflation, and growth is losing pace. But that is worse than that. Some people will rightly tell me, well, the overall figure of growth doesn't really matter because my constituents are poor enough already. Well, the fact is this. Those in areas that voted for Brexit will be hit worse by it in the north of England. So the north-south inequalities won't be helped by Brexit, they will simply be made worse by it. And that, Mr. Speaker, is why Brexit is a sunk cost. And let me tell you, sticking with a plan simply because you've already spent money on it is irrational. And that's why I think we have to ask ourselves the hardest of questions. Should we really keep going along with Brexit just because we said we would, despite the costs, whatever happens, because we've spent money on it, even if it turns out to be a really bad idea? Now, some people will say, I will give way.
Matt Weston. Thank my honourable friend for giving way to make a very powerful speech. We are now really in project reality, not project fear. We're beginning to see, as she said, some of the indicators of what's happening in our economy. Consumer confidence now at its lowest level since 2012. Business confidence also very low. 4 consecutive quarters of disinvestment. This is what's really eating away, and we should be attacking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I simply listened to the words of the member for Meriden and the member for Birmingham Erdington. I find it very hard to listen to them talk about the unemployment rates in their constituencies and think that Brexit has anything to offer them. It will be a hindrance, not a help, Mr. Speaker. So some in this country who voted for Brexit, who are not from the poorest parts of this country, will say, to be honest, they're not bothered about the cost. They want all of the other things that people talk about, this kind of notion of sovereignty, even though, we've shared sovereignty as a nation for many, many years. They will say, it doesn't matter what it costs, I just want it, it's worth it to them. Well, that's fine, Mr. Speaker, for those people. It's fine to take an irrational decision for yourself. If that's what you really want,
exactly.
Fine. But the question for us in this House is it okay to take an irrational decision on behalf of other people?
Exactly.
And I simply ask, Mr. Speaker, do not we owe our country a bit better than that?
Yeah. David T.C. Davis.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years, those of us who voted for Brexit have been treated with scorn and contempt. We have been derided as a bunch of people living outside the M25, uneducated, bigoted tabloid readers. And over the last few years, in an attempt to try and get us to change our minds, members on all sides, actually, in and out, and various banks and businesses and all sorts of Remain supporting groups have adopted a sort of Project Fear on steroids. Each week we seem to get a more ludicrous scare story. We get told 1 minute that there's going to be mass unemployment as a result of Brexit, and the next minute we're told there's going to be a huge shortage of workers to fill all the jobs that are available. We get told that we're going to run out of food 1 minute, and the next we're told that the farmers are going to be ruined by all of the cheap food imports that are coming in. I was on the radio a few weeks ago with an academic who said that 12,000 people are going to die as a result of a lack of fresh fruit and veg. Needless to say, he was from London, because I could have shown him a few orchards in Monmouth where we grow plenty of fruit and vegetables. These sorts of stories just get more and more silly. Last June, apparently the papers were saying that one of Britain's top private GPs had reported that there had been this huge increase in adultery and venereal disease as a result of Brexit. And the following month, yes, there was a headline in the paper the following month that we were going to get super gonorrhea raging out of control as a result of Brexit. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it almost came as a relief in September when another newspaper, and I think it might even have been The Telegraph, was reporting that there was going to be a shortage of Viagra as a result of Brexit. So you see, Mr. Speaker, in the space of just 3 or 4 months, Britain had been turned from Sodom and Gomorrah into Eden before the fall as a result of Brexit. These stories, Mr. Speaker, are frankly ludicrous, and they're not fooling anyone. They certainly didn't fool me. And I went, actually, with the members of the Welsh Affairs.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Can I assure him from direct personal knowledge the story I told earlier on about Karen Vaughan being ordered to apply for permission to become a foreigner in her own country is 100% true? Will he accept that it's true, and will he tell me whether he thinks that is an acceptable consequence of his Brexit?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know his constituent, but my wife is an EU national, although she wouldn't call herself one. She's a Hungarian. And she will have to apply, as no doubt everyone else will, and I think that's perfectly fair, and it's all going to be done on a straightforward application. It's not going to cost any money. And why is it, Mr. Speaker, so unreasonable for the government to want to make a few checks on those people who have chosen to come and live in this country and to take back control of our immigration process? I fully support the government in doing this, and I believe they've gone about it in a perfectly reasonable fashion. But I'd like to tell the honourable gentleman opposite that the real experts in all of this at the port of Holyhead told us very clearly that they were perfectly well prepared for a no-deal Brexit. They made it clear that it had caused some inconvenience and a bit of extra work for them, but they knew what paperwork was required, and they actually said to us, and it was a cross-party delegation, they said to us that they wanted a message to go back to members of Parliament to dampen down the fears of Armageddon, because it simply isn't going to happen. The real experts are prepared. The 17.4 million people who took part in the original and genuine people's vote and voted for Brexit did so because they know that this economy is the 5th biggest economy in the world, and that Great Britain can stand on its own 2 feet with or without a deal. I will vote for a deal with its imperfections because I believe in compromise. And I can accept a bit of a compromise, and that's why I back the Prime Minister. It is for others on the other side of this chamber, and some are on our own side, to also accept that we all have to compromise if we want to sort this out. If they truly believe their own scare stories, they would be queuing up to back the Prime Minister's deal. We should leave at the end of March. We can leave with a deal. We should not be in the least bit afraid to leave without a deal. The 17.4 million people who are confident and optimistic about the future of this country expect members of Parliament, their political leaders, to show that same optimism and confidence.
Speaker, well, the theme of what my remarks is that we do need to build a consensus, though I must confess that the speech from the Honourable Member for Monmouth hasn't made that any easier. Because delay and uncertainty are now really damaging our economy. This is not simply a question of politicians holding their nerve while some macho arm wrestling game is played, either in Parliament or with Brussels, because this is having a real effect on the real economy, on our reputation and on jobs of real people in the world.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She may have seen that in today's Evening Standard there are reports that Westfield's £1.4 billion investment in Croydon is going to be reviewed, in part due to Brexit, as well as the structural changes in the high street. This is happening right now. The people of Croydon need Westfield. We need to rule out no deal.
Well, my honourable friend has given yet another example. Reading the Financial Times in the course of February, we have seen the following headlines. Nissan reverses investment pledge. Trade deal with Japan won't be completed. No deal will lead to 2 more years of austerity. The economy shrank in December. Businesses are moving to Holland and Ireland. And in my constituency, as in my honourable friends, this is playing out badly. Sheep farmers terrified of a 45% tariff on exports. But the pharmaceutical industry spending millions of pounds on stockpiling medicines. Brickmakers worrying about unfair competition from China. And a foreign-owned manufacturer who said to me about the prospect of no deal, no, it won't be catastrophic for our business, but we will have to sack several hundred of your constituents. Well, that'll be a catastrophe for those people who lose their jobs. And that's why I shall be supporting Amendment A and E, and if it's necessary, the bill from the member for Pontefract and Castleford and Dorset West. But I also think we need to look beyond the short term and what we're going to do to prevent us from crashing out at how we come to a decision on where we go next. We need to acknowledge that not everyone is going to get their first choice. There will have to be compromise in this House, and we need institutional arrangements to facilitate this. The Amendment C, which was put forward by the Father of the House, is designed to do this. It hasn't been selected today, but I hope honourable members will look at it seriously and consider whether we might need to come back to something like this in a fortnight's time. Because the fact of the matter is that Thomas Cromwell invented the current division system in 1529 in order to expose and intimidate those opposed to the King's will. Yeah. Well, binary choices are all right for some things, but the minute you have a complex problem with multiple options, they do not serve well for good decision making. It's been very easy, and it continues to be easy, to make coalitions against propositions. It's extremely difficult to build coalitions for anything. And we saw this not just in Brexit but on the House of Lords. We all wanted reform but we couldn't get it because in 2003 every option was voted down. In 2007 4 options were voted through but there wasn't a clear steer. OK, House of Lords reform, it's not the biggest, most important issue in the world. But Brexit is really important. We can't make the same mistake again. We must use a different approach. And we have suggested using one that we use for choosing our select committee chairs.
The Honourable Lady gave away. She's arguing very articulately for the scheme which she put forward and persuaded me to join her in recommending. But does she agree that one thing that's causing the chaos today is the Remain element in this House are not all pursuing the same end because they've all got their own preferred route? And actually the Leave people in the House on both sides are divided and are going for the same route. And the system she's put together, and she's commending in the speech, would actually bring them to coalesce on the most popular, and it's highly likely that both the Remain side and the Leave side will come together, and in my opinion demonstrate the Remain side is in the majority.
Well, the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman is absolutely correct, because there's a lot of gamesmanship going on at the moment in this House, and as he says, it's being played by members on all sides. Everybody is hoping to be the last man standing. And that is a tactic which would not be possible if we had paper ballots where every option was put simultaneously and we came to find out what the shared view and the shared consensus was. And we're not proposing anything in secret. We're not suggesting a hiding place for members of Parliament. We're suggesting full transparency, and nor are we doing anything to undermine the whips, because full transparency means they could whip it exactly as they do with deferred divisions, which we use every week with our pink sheets. So we just want to urge honourable members to look beyond this to where we want to be in a month's time. And I think we really need to say that if we want the country to be less divided, we need to show the way. Parliamentarians are constantly urging on their fellow citizens the need to be flexible, the need to embrace change. Well, perhaps, for once, we should lead by example.
Connie Elphick. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, the member for Bishop Auckland. Listening to this debate, it struck me that it's Valentine's Day today. And you wouldn't know it, the way this place carries on and everyone goes at each other hammer and tongs. So I think we ought to perhaps go back a little bit and actually just remember what happened and why we're in this situation, and that is that people voted to leave the European Union. And I backed Remain. But I had a strong mandate. 2/3 of my constituency said they wanted to leave, and I regard it as my job to make sure that we do execute those instructions that we have been provided, and that we should leave the European Union. And it's important to remember why people voted that way. They believed in building a land of opportunity. They believe in the kind of Britain that we can build as an independent, sovereign nation. They believe in taking back control of our borders, our trade policy, our money, and our prospects across the world. And many members of this House reject that view to this day. But that's what people wanted to do, and they are not wrong to have done that. They're not wrong because in recent decades, Europe has been in relative decline. It was a third of global GDP, a few decades ago, and today it's just 15%. Future world growth, 90% of future world growth is coming from outside the European Union, not from inside the European Union. So, therefore, I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I just want to pull him up on that. He's just said relative decline and produced a statistic. This is not in decline. That's just other places in the world welcomely coming up, and it's great to see that other places in the world and other people outside Europe are becoming richer. So, Europe's not in decline.
Well, he raises an interesting point. The fact of the matter is that Europe is becoming relatively less important in the world, and the rest of the world is becoming relatively more important. So is our national destiny best served by more Europe or more of the world and more globalisation? And I won't take any lectures from a Member of Parliament who represents a party that wants to tear away Scotland from the biggest market that they have, which I think is just crass and irresponsible and frankly reckless. So we need to bear in mind that people believed in the kind of future they can build, and we need to make that happen. And I speak to people in Dover and Deal I represent about this, and they say, well, what's going on? You know, why don't you just get on with it? Why are we still talking about it? Why is Parliament not just getting on with it? And that is the right question. We need to just get on with it, end the uncertainty, leave the European Union, and make the best of it. Give way.
Can you tell us what his constituents think we're going to be getting on with? Because as things stand, we have no idea what a relationship with Europe is going to be like in 2 years' time. So what exactly is it people are telling him to get on with?
Well, they're telling very clearly that we should leave the European Union, and I personally think that what we should do is see the government fully embrace the Malthouse Compromise, which offers a positive way forward to make sure we can have open, seamless trade without being stuck within the European orbit as a form of satellite state. And that's why I particularly take issue with the party opposite. They say, oh, they're in favour of leaving Europe, but they want to remain in the customs union, and they want to continue to have freedom of movement. And then they talk about how, well, it's all terribly complicated. Maybe we should extend Article 50 as a bridge. Now, anyone looking at extending Article 50 as a bridge for 3 months or 9 months knows that that's a bridge to nowhere. But the party opposite aren't really wanting to build a bridge to nowhere. They want to build a bridge back into the European Union. It is a bridge to remain. And that is the wrong thing to do, because what we ought to be doing is all of us coming together to make sure we leave the European Union successfully. We leave the European successfully by reworking the backstop, making sure that we take a strong position to the European Union, a strong and clear position to the European Union, that we are prepared to leave deal or no deal, because everyone in this House knows that the European Union business is really done at 5 to midnight. And it being done at 5 to midnight, we should press that point strongly. We should have the courage to see it through. We should have the courage to see through the demands and hopes and aspirations of our constituents to make sure that we successfully leave the European Union and move on and end these debates by making sure that we chart our future onwards. And we should be spending more time, Mr. Speaker, talking about the kind of Brexit Britain that we can build after we leave Europe, rather than banging on endlessly with these debates where people constantly are trying to countermand the instruction of the British people because they really want to remain.
Order. Interventions are, of course, part and parcel of debate, but I simply say for purposes of advice to the House, given the constraints upon time, interventions now undertaken should be undertaken in the knowledge that you're stopping other people speaking. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now been 67 days since the Prime Minister delayed the meaningful vote in December. 67 utterly wasted days for our country as the clock ticks down to 11 p.m. on the 29th of March. The Prime Minister continues the pretence that she's seeking concessions from the EU, but she knows she's not going to get them. We all know her reckless game. Keep that clock ticking down and keep bullying MPs into backing her deal or no deal. But we also know this is a false choice, as our country is simply not prepared for a no-deal scenario. The government's failure to reach out and build cross-party consensus has left us in deadlock. So, how do we unlock this logjam? Well, the answer's been hiding in plain sight, and it's called Common Market 2.0. Common Market 2.0 would mean joining Norway outside of the EU but inside EFTA and the EEA, establishing a form of customs union with the EU, maintaining a close economic relationship with the EU, but leaving the more political aspects of European integration. Common Market 2.0 would involve leaving the withdrawal agreement precisely as it is, whilst radically recasting the political declaration on the future relationship, something that the EU has repeatedly said it's open to doing. The Leader of the Opposition's letter to the Prime Minister on 7th of February was certainly a step in the right direction, but it's vital that we put more flesh on the bones by making an explicit commitment to joining the EEA via the EFTA pillar. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's political declaration is a bridge to nowhere. Common Market 2.0 would transform the political declaration into a bridge to a clear, stable and exciting future for our country. It would mean safeguarding jobs,